Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Protector of the Fairies in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Protector of the Fairies. Journeying into the desert. I'm telling you, something's off in here, Ichigo heard his Edala's self say in his mind. This isn't a good idea. You are hardly at your best and you want to fight Baragan like this. We've discussed this already, Ichigo shot back, continuing to walk through the desert of sand before him. His hollow disguise had been abandoned only recently after he stopped encountering even the odd one or two hollows, and now he had even had to stop using Sonido to progress further and stay undetected. He was getting close to Baragan's supposed fortress, if the data on it from Laxus was any indication. All he had were estimates though, and so talking to the beings in his mind was the greatest way to pass the time. Their latest topic was one he had heard his Edala's self coming back to a lot right now. His ability to fight. Considering I've been using the time since fighting the Quincy to draw in magic, my reserves are back up to decent levels. I'm not going to burn out anytime soon and should be able to utilize my Bankai for a decent amount of time. Just because you can, doesn't mean there won't be problems. He could hear his Edala's self let out a groan of frustration in his mind. Obviously his reluctance to fall back and abandon this action was driving the former king insane, but it wasn't like there was going to be another chance like this, and he explained that too. I get that, came the response. Trust me, I do get that. But just because you managed to recover some magical power, it doesn't mean mentally you're ready to fight again. I'm still trying to help balance your recovered Quincy powers, and I'm not even close to understanding how to deal with the Shinigami nature in them. If you use Let's still, I'm honestly unsure of how long we'll be able to maintain that power for with so much more to focus on and keep balanced. You seem to underestimate how much that old man did compared to the rest of us. He doesn't need to use that technique if he's alone, his hollow said as it voiced its own views. And with that strength, he'll crush Baragan with ease. We don't have to worry about keeping that power in check like that annoying Quincy technique. Yes, because having his bones being crushed constantly is a fun experience. You think strength comes without cost? It doesn't. Besides, you think he'd even use it at all if he couldn't take the pain? He can handle it, and when he's alone he can freely go all out without worrying about the casualty count. Ichigo began to tune the two out as they argued back and forth, turning his attention briefly to Mavis on his shoulder as he kept walking. You alright? You've been quiet for a while now. I'm fine, Mavis replied as she turned to look at him. Just remembering the memory you saw of Zeref. Those words had the immediately impact of making Ichigo's good mood disappear. Ah. I remember. Natsu. He's Zeref's brother, Mavis said in agreement. We knew there was a reason Zeref blocked the name and face, and we were right to assume it was because we'd recognize him the moment we saw him. Though I'm still confused on why we were able to see Natsu's face at the end and hear his name. Even in the rest of the memory, the image was still blurry. It's because that memory was painful, Ichigo replied back. As much as I hate to say anything like this, I can understand his mistake there. He tried to block out everything relating to his brother's identity, but that probably meant he was scouring each and every memory that he could to do so. But I felt the same pain he did in that memory. The hatred he felt to the world, the anger he felt about himself, and the pain that only grew as time passed. That moment that we saw Natsu. Zeref probably missed that moment because that part of the memory hurt more than anything else. Even if he hadn't realized it, he probably avoided it because he didn't want to relieve it even for a single second. I'm more worried though about what this means about Natsu. Mavis nodded. We saw him. He was dead in that memory. Maybe the others will provide more information for us on him. Even if Zeref is immortal, Natsu has aged normally. Something must have happened that allowed that, and something must have been done to even bring him back in the first place. Though it'll take a while to find a memory with clues at the pace we're going. Can you look through the memories quicker for me? I think I'm starting to get an understanding on Zeref, but at this rate we won't have time to spend more months on examining these memories in detail. We've seen how he began, and hopefully from here we'll be able to see what happened next. I'll make sure to save any memories that hold promise for you to fully view later on. Do you mind if I go ahead and get a start now? I don't want to leave you alone, but with this much time I might as well get ahead on them while I have the chance. Plus there's something I want to check out too, so I can kill two birds with one stone. Go ahead, Ichigo said, watching for a moment as Mavis disappeared from his shoulder and returned to his soul. It was an odd feeling, to be honest. He had originally been afraid that he would have had troubles from her with the loss of the absorb, but here she was able to still freely manifest out from her hiding place in his soul. Uriu had theorized that they had their own individual scripts buried underneath Waiwaka's own, and that those fragments from Waiwak had been influenced as a result and taken on those abilities to some degree, but they hadn't really had proof until now. But he could tell it felt far too different to what he had grown familiar with. Whatever combat abilities it might have had were non-existent, it appeared, likely because the absorb had replaced any need for any. Instead, the feeling he got from it was that it functioned similar to his memory copying technique and the ability he had used before to hide items in his soul. He wondered what had happened to Uriu's. Had his taken on a similar state? Or had it developed differently due to the different fragment of Waiwak influencing it? He would have liked to ask, but there hadn't been time when he had the chance. Plus Uriu appeared to have some issue with his father that he had been conflicted with, and he hadn't wanted to disturb that considering his own troubles with his father in the past. There was also that matter Wendy had mentioned to him briefly before she had retreated back to the medical ward. Nabara had done something. He wasn't entirely sure how, but he had fused himself to Wendy, and even Mavis wasn't sure what that meant as a result. Whether Nabara's actions would turn into a blessing or a curse, they could only hope it would be the former rather than the latter. And then there was still the matter of the magical barrier particles. He had stopped very briefly just examine the damage done to the barrier before leaving through the hole. The energy had been lingering more than it had the last time he had found remnants of it against the barrier, likely because of the greater quantity used. Its foulness was even worse too, and it reminded him of things he didn't want to remember. Had Levi or Laxus been there? What was Avatar's goal with this? None of it made sense, scattered like it was, and for the life of him he couldn't see the connection between all these events. None of them could. Coming to a stop, he had to forcefully drag himself away from such thoughts in order to look at the Garganta forming. That wasn't good. His hands were already reaching for his swords as it began to open, clutching the handles of each blade tightly as the rip in space opened up to reveal the dark void within. He didn't expect for a bright form of light to suddenly slam down out of the portal and land head first in the ground. That wasn't a hollow. Another fell out of the portal, a familiar set of white hair appearing before that figure also fell straight towards the ground. Only the third managed to step out of the Garganta gracefully, a familiar white mask covering the man's face before he raised his hand back to the rip in space and snapped his fingers. From each side, the Garganta slowly began to close until the ends being sealed reached the middle and the whole thing vanished. Only then did the bone-white mask on the familiar figure's face fade away, revealing the smirk he had almost expected to see the moment he had recognized these individuals. Shinji. What are you doing here? What do you think? Shinji replied in amusement. I overheard Kisuke and the others talking and realized what you were going to do from that. So naturally I grabbed my gear as quickly as I could and headed right on after you. With some tag-alongs. You weren't exactly being subtle when I found you, said Toshiro as he pushed himself out of the sand, helping Mr. out himself before shaking some of it out of his hair. I found out almost immediately. That's because I ran past you and you followed me. The chances of that were already extremely low. And then you ended up talking too loudly about your plans as you ran into me, Mr. added as he tried to wipe away the sand from his suit before realizing it was becoming a futile effort. I'm amazed our group is this small as it is. I'm not going to find Nozomi popping up next, am I? Ichigo asked. He had expected amusement or even some kind of acknowledgement that he was right. Not what he got instead, looks of concern sent his way. What? This might not be the best time to mention this, muttered Shinji, scratching the back of his awkwardly before lowering it and shrugged. Might as well treat this like a band-aid. Nozomi's missing. Sorry. Could you repeat that? Shinji heard most of it, Mr. said, walking towards Ichigo with Toshiro while Shinji brought himself back down from the air. Apparently she never returned to the Genesis. Why she didn't or what happened is unclear, but... Well, I do trust her, so I'm sure she's fine, but the timing of this is suspicious. And seeing your reaction right now means that you definitely didn't expect this either. The enemy does know how important she is to a lot of our movements. There aren't many that could stop her like this though. Except maybe Yukio, Ichigo muttered. Nozomi said he was interested in her. That's twice now that he's trapped her in his own dimension. Once at the Magic Council and then again for a brief period when Ziref and Alvarez made a move on the Celestial Spirit King. Knowing her she'll be fine, Mist Agan added quickly, his attempts to reassure Ichigo not working as well as he wanted with his own worry leaking in, but we thought you should at least know now rather than later. Thanks, Ichigo muttered gratefully. I'm sure she'll be alright. She's capable of escaping his dimension anyway if he was the cause of it. But that has a tendency to cause a time delay depending on how the dimensions are overlapping, so she could be gone, but safe, for a while. Until then there isn't much we can do about it. Tilting his head curiously, he quickly added, though how did you even catch up to me? I had a hard start from the North Battlefield, and I don't remember you ever using a Garganta before. How did you do it? Oh, it was simple, Shinji said boastfully. All it needed was the right instinct to open up the doorway. Ichigo nodded in agreement at his words. It was certainly true that hollow abilities functioned very much off instincts. While it could be difficult to fully master them, the skills that came naturally to all hollows were very much simple once you managed to use them once. Impressive. I didn't even know we could make one, but then I was always more bothered with the physical abilities like Sonido and instant regeneration. How come you never mentioned it before? Ah. Well, it's because He only got it working today, Taoshiro said before Shinji could try and make up an excuse. He said all his other attempts had failed because he couldn't figure out the right trigger for it. Details, Shinji said as he waved the previous failures away. It worked when it needed to, as I thought it would. I just never had the right need to use it, and so I couldn't summon up the hollow instincts necessary to learn how to open the Garganta. Well, that's good to hear, Ichigo said. Shinji shot back a more honest smile for a moment before he noticed a hand landing on his shoulder, Ichigo pushing past him before walking away from the group. Head back and help the others. They'll need you more than I will. He got a few steps away before Shinji's brain finally managed to catch up to the words. What did you say? I said go back, Ichigo replied back without turning. I'll deal with Baragan myself. There are thousands of others that need your help more than I do. You can do far more good there, so go back. If you could open the Garganta once, you should be able to do it again. So he paused when Shinji suddenly appeared in front of him, all traces of silliness or amusement stripped from his face. No. Shinji, I won't say it again. Go back. Then I'll say this again. No. I'm not leaving here. None of us are, Taoshiro added from behind Ichigo. We came to help you. We aren't just going to leave because you think others need the help more. I don't think that, Ichigo shot back. I know that. The forces there are outnumbered heavily. They don't stand a chance, and they barely will even with help from the others. Every extra person here means less fighting power there, which will only work to further decreases their chance of survival. Then why are you here? Shinji asked, pressing on with his words as Ichigo lowered his head. You're here to fight Baragan. I agree with that, this chance is unavoidable for us. But then that is entirely the reason in my mind. It's unavoidable, which means he must already be sure that you will come for him. Even if Starcase words weren't a trap, Baragan's intentions here pretty much scream as being one. Which is all the more reason for you to go alone, right? Shinji shook his head. Sorry, but I'm not letting you do that. What kind of friend would I be if I let you walk into this mess alone? Whether you want us to or not, we're going with you. Even if it means more might die back at the barrier. Shinji shrugged. Some might find this cruel, but I've never been afraid to say how I feel with this kind of stuff. All those people, they are strangers. I'll fight for them if you are doing so, but between the choice of helping them and helping you, the choice is obvious. I'd rather protect the few over the many, regardless of how the world might treat me for that. Many people would disagree with you. Shinji nodded. Then let them. I don't care about them. In this world, there are few I do care about. Toshiro, the list I have is small, but because of that I prioritize any on that list above all else. You can say whatever you want, argue for days with me on this, and my stance will never chance. If you're planning to walk into a trap, then you better be ready to have friend watching your back. That's your answer, huh? Glancing over his shoulder to Toshiro, Ichigo asked the same to him. What about you, Toshiro? I don't want more to die, he admitted. But equally I understand just how important it is for us to end Baragan here once and for all. If Baragan falls, then we'll save far more lives today as a result. Even if we fought of the Hollows today, it would become meaningless if we had lost the chance to end the war against them when we could have and more die in the process. If it means increasing your chance for victory by even 1%, I'm willing to risk it. And you, Mr. Ogun? I've always followed your orders, Mr. Ogun said calmly. But even I will disobey them if it means ensuring your safety. I'll take any punishment necessary for this, but in return I'll fight by your side today and ensure you win. Ichigo sighed. None of you have any intentions of backing down to you. They all shook their heads. I didn't expect so. And there's nothing I can do to stop you. You could beat us up until we can't move, Shinji supplied. But you won't do that. Whether you like it or not, you're stuck with us. Just like old times. I don't deserve you guys as friends, Ichigo muttered before nodding, much the happiness of the others. Fine, come along. But in exchange for this you better all be prepared to live through this. Baragan is not a foe any of you can take on without me, so make sure none of you get in over your heads. Picking up his pace as he passed Shinji again, he took note of how the three fell into his pace with him, Shinji sticking by his side while the other two trailed behind them in their shadows. Let's go then. To the home of the Hollows. Protector of the Fairies. All right, explain this to me again, said Ishine as he crossed his arms. You plan to teleport this ship, one of the most important strategic resources we have in this war, and blow it up right in the middle of the Hollow Army. Am I missing anything here? No, that sums it up quite well, Hibiki said. After that it'll be imperative that we retake the entrance they made to the barrier. According to updated reports, it appears a tunnel has formed and hollows streamed through it from underground once a hole was opened up. It's being held for the moment, but that won't last without reinforcements, and we might be the fastest support that they can get considering the forces present would have to fight through a mass of hollows in an enclosed area to even reach there first. I still can't believe this happened after I stepped away from the front lines, Ishine muttered. All the people under my command who died. He shook his head rapidly to try and rid himself of those depressing thoughts. All right, I get what we need to do. And when this ship blows, it should at least disorientate the Hollow Army and give us a chance to move in. But isn't there also a chance it'll destroy the barrier edge if it's too close? Kisuke and Hades don't think it will, but it'll definitely weaken it a lot. If the Minos Grandes keep firing at the barrier after that, they'll probably manage to break through. But by the time they do we hopefully should have been able to regain control of our land. A lot of the Minos might even die if we're lucky. Honestly, it depends on how large the blast zone is. You're not sure? Hibiki shrugged. This ship is advanced. Like really advanced. The technology is a mix of our current level and some from decades ahead of our time. All the blueprints we have, we got from Hades' own airship and improved from there. And the actual potential of this technology is meant to be centuries ahead since we only have a fraction of its full capabilities unlocked after all this time. I can predict how large the blast zone will be typically, but I can always be wrong since we just about have a basic understanding of half this technology. Glancing around at the ship for a moment, Ishine slowly shook his head in disappointment. It's a shame we're going to have to lose this ship. It's been a great help for many. It has been, but after the Quincy grounded it we already would have trouble repairing it in the first place. Even if we had teams working overtime on repairing the missing engine and hull, we would never finish it in time. And we can't afford to let even a scrap of this technology fall into enemy hands either. Could you imagine the destruction Alvarez could do if they had even one part of this ship replicated in their entire fleet? It would be a massacre, Ishine agreed. They lost significant numbers, but if they had this level of technological advancement in what remained, it would make them even more dangerous than when they were attacking the barrier in mass. Exactly. I'm funneling power into all systems right now too to prepare for an overload. When the reactor blows, it should take everything with it. But on the off chance it doesn't, the sudden influx of power into systems already full of power should, and I say should because I've never had a chance to test this, damage the more delicate internal components beyond repair and prevent any enemies from learning about them. A miniaturized Etherian cannon is useless with just the shell if you don't know how the technology was miniaturized in the first place. I assume you have already began evacuating anything of importance. I've sent a message to everyone on board to tell them to be quick about it too. All except a few missing crewmates. Ichigo's not here, I'm assuming. Well, he had already gone ahead, but I'm actually talking about some others. Shinji, Taoshiro, and Miss Dogen have all vanished. I'd be worried, but you know where they're going. Is Hein finished for Hibiki, getting a nod in return. And where, pray tell me, do you think they are all going together? Baragan's base? We don't know that for certain, but it's the most likely outcome based on what we know so far. Stopping to look at how Hein was taking the news, Hibiki raised an eyebrow briefly when he didn't get much of a reaction from him. You're taking this well? Ichigo will do what he wants. And going after the enemy boss right now, while hasty, does have its advantages. Better for me to trust that they'll succeed and for us to focus on the enemy before us right now. Let's take this one problem at a time. Starting with how you plan to blow the Genesis up. You said you would cause the reactor to melt down, but how? We increase the energy output, Hibiki explained. The reactor has what we call its safe operating limit. Typically we use that as our benchmark for 100% power. Above that we can begin generating even more power, which means even more power for all systems however we might want to distribute it. But as the previous name would tell you, it's above what is safe. The reactor as a result will begin to undergo a meltdown, breaking apart under the pressure it's enduring in order to produce that much extra power. By pushing it to its max immediately, we can ensure that reaction happens in a less than ideal way. Especially if we keep the energy stored inside and let it build. And when it finally hits critical mass, the reactor will give and all that power will escape outwards, engulfing everything around it that doesn't have some kind of shielding capable of handling a blast equivalent to a small, decent-sized portion of Etherian. And this can be done remotely. Hibiki paused for a moment. Not quite. I won't be able to start the meltdown until the ship has been teleported. Otherwise it could interfere with Mest's magic when he teleports us all there. And afterwards, there is the time necessary to bring the reactor to meltdown. I'd estimate it would take about 5 minutes at most considering we are trying to completely break the ship, but that also means we have 5 minutes to wait until it goes. Once set up there isn't much we need to do. But if something was to go wrong and the Hollows attacked, we need to guard the ship until that point, as Hein said in realization. You plan to stay behind to ensure nothing goes wrong in the process. Someone's got to do it, Hibiki revealed. Mest will be exhausted, but he said he should be able to manage another small jump after we arrive, ensuring we can get out. But we will be cutting it extremely close to make sure nothing can go wrong. The rest of you all should do one of two things. Either defend and be able to clear the blast zone in time, even if that means flying upwards for those able to do so, or pushing towards the hole the Hollows have in that time and taking cover in it. The blast should mostly be contained on the surface and the hole should take you all deep enough that you'll be safe. And once you're in the tunnel it'll be much easier to fight the Hollows without having to watch every side. Their numbers will be packed together a lot more too, which will only benefit you in such tight quarters. Well? Think you'll all be able to do it? Hein frowned, one hand under his chin in thought. We should be able to. How many do we have in total? There's me, Kisuk, Hades, Gray and Karen. Orga and Urza are with Fairy Tail with Gildarts, Yuzua and Levi, while Wendy and Kelia are going to tag along with them. Shinji, Taoshiro, and Miss Dogen are with Ichigo, Nozomi's missing, and Uryu and Ryukin have decided to stick around with us for the time being. Then there is only you and Mest left. That means we have 7 of us in fighting condition here to push to the tunnel while you and Mest will retreat after that. Do you have a safe zone you can reach? Not quite. Sorry to add more troubles to you, but with the mess that will be occurring, we'll be teleporting to you lot. It'll be the safest place we can reach with all the hollows present and our inability to open the barrier in such chaos. Think you'll be able to handle escorting a few VIPs until Mest can recover? I'll do my best, Ishain said in reply. Maybe we should seal off the entrance though on our way. Might slow down the hollows. You have 5 minutes to clear a path to the tunnel in the first place, all the while trying to keep them focused on you lot and not the Genesis. You won't have time to seal off the tunnel too. Ishain nodded. Fair enough. Alright then, we'll do that. Any more news from Jura or Yuryuki? None from Yuryuki, but Jura thinks she's still alive and fighting. Jura said he'll give us the word when they all begin to try and retake the area they lost. They are still gathering mages, but they are almost ready to fight back. You should be prepared to be ready for any moment though. When we get the message, we'll be moving to leave as fast as we can. Protector of the Fairies. So do you think they'll accept Ziref's proposal? God Serenus coughed as he increased his pace to walk ahead of his companion, not liking how Jin immediately made to match his pace and prevent him from doing so for more than a few moments. Of course they will. They'd be foolish not to. But watch your words. My words? Who's going to hear me say it? The wind. Magic can act in a variety of ways. Oh, and you'd be an expert on it, wouldn't you, Mr. Oken? Jin gave another smirk as the signs of frustration appeared on the edges of Serena's expression, the Oken appearing to be trying to do his best to not simply attack him outright. But trust me, I'm sure we'd be able to tell somehow if someone was close enough to hear us. It is still better to be safe. Ziref will not be happy if we reveal his identity, whether it's to the enemy or his own allies. Won't that be one massive mess when people like August learn? Jin muttered in amusement. Want to take some bets on how he'll react? I'm sure that artificially made son of his will have a mental breakdown too, considering how much Larcade has been talking about being the one to rid him of Ziref for him. The idiot doesn't even remember his own past with all the modifications done to him. It's hilarious to see Ziref's reactions every time he hears Larcade's boosts and attempts for praise when he doesn't even understand why he seeks it so much. I'd rather not push our luck. Besides, we have more important matters to deal with right now than your foolish betting. Yeah, Jin said, not at all apologetic for his attempts at messing with him. I'm surprised we've been kept this long though. Doesn't he know we can't wait this long? August will be coming to pick us up soon and we still need to travel to the meetup point. He'll be here, God Serena replied simply. Even he knows it's in bad form to keep a star waiting. Be patient a little while longer. I think I can even see him now. Turning his head towards the edge of the golden barrier they were at, Jin opened his eyes slightly to stare at the approaching figure. Yep, there he is. He kept us waiting long enough. It takes time for an individual such as himself to travel from one place to another, especially with the number of eyes watching him. Oh, I know, Jin replied, resting his hands behind his head. Still doesn't mean I have to stop complaining. Waiting for the man to finish approaching them, Jin added to God Serena, think he's got some new order for us? He hasn't given one in months beyond stay put. If he's calling us out, something must have changed. Obviously, God Serena stated. The main actors have all been gathered and the play is entering its final act. With the demons gone, the Quincy mostly demolished, and the current attempt on Barragan's part, all the while Acknowledge draws near, it's only natural that he has decided to act. Pretty soon the play will hit its climax, so it is only natural that we will also be moving more as a result. Fair enough. So long as I get a shot at my goal, I'm fine with whatever he's got for us. I assume you are too. Indeed. My old allies were far too naive in their actions, but at least soon I'll be able to prove to them I was right. But enough of that for now. He's here. The edge of the barrier before them briefly glowed before a small section began to lower. It was a gateway, like many of the others used around the barrier. The difference here was that it wasn't one of the official ones at the main battlefields, nor one of the personal ones Ichigo Kurosaka could make on demand. Stepping out of it, cloaked in a dark cloak that hid his magical power, stood a weary-looking man who was making moves to remove his hood. With it pulled free, long white hair was free to fall down the man's back, revealing to them a face they doubted anyone would be unable to recognize. Thank you for meeting me on such short notice, Juoshiro said as he stood before the two. I'm glad you both could make it. Protector of the fairies. Did you see the look on his face? Levi tried to hold in her laughs before giving up entirely, clutching her sides as she fell back against the bed she was sitting on. Oh God. Haha. That was the best. Do you think he'll really mention us to Ichigo? You fail to recognize the severity your actions could cause, a female voice called out to her. Levi briefly managed to look up as her laughter subsided, the dark-skinned woman with white hair that she had met a few times staring down at her angrily. What was her name again? She didn't remember it, so that meant she had either ignored or it hadn't been listening when it was given. Hello Briar, she heard the pink-haired girl nearby said, the smile she wore being sent towards her instead of the woman in question. She'd have to thank Arlok's granddaughter later. Mary was a lifesaver at times like this. It wasn't that she wanted to start fights with half the group in Avatar. They just had a very big difference of opinion on what they should be doing with their power, and it was easier to deal with without messes like this being caused when they could have been averted. Did you get back from your mission? What happened? It was a dud, Briar responded angrily. It was meant to hold a cache of information on the time period of our Lord, and instead it contained nothing more than the scratches of heretics. Is that so? I hope you burnt it all to the ground then. Of course I did, the woman replied, her anger making way for an expression of adoration. I hope Lord Mimiheiji was happy with his offering. And people say I'm sick, Levi muttered, pushing herself back up into a sitting position. So, let's hear it Briar. What did I do? Briar's anger returned in full force as she turned back towards her. Seriously, did that woman show anything but that emotion towards her? She had seen the woman alter between 4 different emotions in her entire time being here, but only one of them had ever been directed her way. What did you do? You risked exposing our existence. We were right in front of the barrier and engaged by Yoryuki Shihaorin, the goddess of Flash, and Juranikis, the army's stone giant. I think at this point people are starting to take note of us. That is true. But taunting them is not beneficial for us. And neither is you revealing your identity to one of them. We have been allowed to move so freely because our existence has remained hidden, and we cannot afford to be lax when we are getting closer to our main objective. Yeah, heard it all before, Levi said in annoyance. All praise Mimiheiji and whatnot. Sorry, but I wasn't going to miss the chance to piss off a few people when I had the chance. In case you forgot, I'm not doing this because of some kind of devotion. Our goals just merely align, and this god you worship can go piss off for all I care. Out of the corner of her eye she could see Mary glaring at her. Had she stepped over the line again? It was so easy to do with these cultists that it was easier to keep track of when she hadn't done so. But as she turned her focus back to Briar, she found the woman looking sadly at her. That was new. My lord, Briar said in prayer, grasping her hands together and shutting her eyes. This poor lamb has become lost. How pitiful it is, to see one of your chosen unable to focus on anything but her own revenge against the cruel magic of this world. If only she could accept your righteousness too and realize the truth path to the happiness she seeks. She wanted to tell the woman that wasn't going to happen, but she guessed she had probably pushed her luck enough for one day. Anyone else saying those kind of words to these cultists would have been cut down on the spot or tortured for days. She had a lot of leeway only because she had one of the purest sources of magical barrier particles ever found, with Laxus owning the other. Plus it didn't hurt that the person she wanted to kill more than anything was Nukin. But even that had limits, and they would eventually snap if she pushed them too far. She wondered how long she had to stick it out with this group. Her power had grown in leaps and bounds ever since she started training with the magical barrier particles. The only downside was that it had weakened her magic, but the resulting strength more than made up for it. And her limbs were working perfectly now too, so not even her injuries could hold her back. The issue she would have though was actually moving around without this group. She and Laxus couldn't notice it, but apparently anyone with decent magical ability would be able to sense them easily if they passed by. Something about their energy leaving a trace mages didn't like, or something similar. That left them with little choice right now but to bide their time. Arlok had said time and time again that they would get their chance for revenge, and he hadn't lied about anything thus far, but she was getting impatient. It was bad enough waiting for their first chance, and this time she found it almost unbearable. Whatever Arlok had planned, he better get to it soon so she could finish what she and Laxus had started last time. Playing good minion with cultists wasn't exactly an exciting time after all. Lying back into her bed as Briar started to go off on another rant, this time about how she should take her responsibilities as a chosen more seriously, she closed her eyes and tuned the woman out. She'd get her chance eventually. So long as she kept picturing Ichigo's dead body at her feet, she could wait a bit longer. And until then, she'd just instead imagine the look on his face when he realizes they caused tens of thousands of people to die today and he hadn't been able to do anything to stop it. Yes, she thought with a smile. That would do for now. Protector of the fairies. The last mermaid stands defiant. We've been walking for a while now, Shinji muttered in annoyance. Have we even got closer yet, or is that place just that massive? Laxus said it was, Ichigo replied, staring at the large structure in the distance. Lost No Chase is a big place, but even I didn't expect it to be as big as he said. It's unsettling how it was even constructed without the Magic Council learning of its existence. They could have known, Toshiro supplied helpfully. Or maybe it was a remnant of an old structure already there. Definitely the former if anything, Shinji stated after a moment of thought. Until Baragan arrived, there was unlikely any hollows capable of keeping up with the upkeep of such a large-scale building. Hollows have no interest in such menial task without someone forcing them to do it, and the majority of hollows intelligent enough to want a base wouldn't care for one this big. It's hardly a good defendable location unless you have an army capable of guarding it, which Baragan managed to achieve. And if it was the relic of the past and had been left that long, it's unlikely it could be repaired to such a pristine state. Though I will admit that its design is similar to the ruins of some Levi was showing me once in one of her books. Might have been designed after them. So you think the Magic Council might have just ignored it and not deemed it much of a threat? Depends when they learned about it. If they learned about it during the time the chairman was being controlled, I doubt Zeref would have cared enough about it, especially if dealing with it meant drawing another Ukin into a battle with him. If it was discovered beforehand though. Ichigo, what do you think? You worked for them for a time. Would someone like Juashiro have done anything about it? They would have kept it quiet at least, Ichigo said, thinking back to what Juashiro might have done if he had discovered it. They'd want to work out what to do and whether it would be possible to deal with the situation. More pressing threats might have drawn attention away from it, and there's even the possibility that they hadn't deemed it dangerous enough to warrant immediate action. Depending on the situation, it could be harder to fight the Hollows in their own turf than in ours, or at least that's the belief based on them not knowing about the army of Hollows we now face. If they had learned about such numbers they would have done something far sooner, I like to think. That's true, Shinji muttered. The sheer amount of Minos Grandes we've encountered in this war would have needed to be hidden somewhere. There is probably some special place out in this desert where they were hidden away at, since the amount of people that actually entered Hueco Mundo were few and far in between. We sure none are left here? Wouldn't want some hidden surprises on top of this mission of ours. This trap is meant to be appealing because it's unavoidable, Ichigo replied calmly. Having some left behind would just send the wrong message. Baragan is unlikely to have. Ichigo paused, an odd thought occurring as he replayed what he had just said. Have I? Have we had this conversation already? Have we? Shinji came to a stop with the others, glancing around briefly and looking at their surroundings. You know, I kind of feel the same. Toshiro, what about you? It does feel like we've discussed this before, came the white-haired Shinigami's response. Mist Agen. Deja vu, Mist Agen muttered quietly. Why didn't you saying anything? He added even quiet, more forcefully. I just noticed myself. What? Mist Agen looked towards Toshiro, wide eyes being aimed at the Shinigami for a moment until he recomposed himself. Sorry, I didn't mean that. Just annoyed at myself for noticing. It's fine, Mist Agen, Ichigo said. Don't blame yourself for not noticing anything. None of us have until now. But why have we had this conversation before? Something's messing with us, Shinji stated, his eyes resting back on the site of their destination. We haven't been getting closer to that place, but that may very well be intentional. If a trap was to be placed here, I'd expect it would be one that would work best with the environment around us. It likely covers a short width too. Too costly to cover a massive area if it needs to encircle the base. Think you could use Mavis to do that fairy sphere trick of yours to get us past this point? Worth a short. I'll get her attention. Hopefully she's not too engrossed in handling a favor I asked her for to help us out here. It didn't take much for his thoughts to reach her. After a few moments of quickly explaining the situation, she was already taking form hanging from his shoulder and eyeing the area around them. Well. Time magic, Mavis muttered, glancing around different points with interest. Impressive work to be honest. There's a bound area where time continuously loops back. A few minutes at most from the look of it. So we have to get out of the zone before it loops back? Toshiro asked, getting a shake of her head from Mavis. No, not now that you all noticed the loop. While the area we're in loops back, it's very different with people. If we had been in here when it started, we would have been constantly affected because we would have been recorded as natural pieces of the zone. But since we're foreign entities, it can only try and pull us back. Our bodies will be caught in it, but our minds are another matter entirely, only suppressed by the effect so long as we don't notice. Once you realize you're in the loop, its grip on you massively weakens. Great, Shinji stated as he prepared to move forward. Then we can just hurry on ahead and leave this place before it starts again. Mavis shook her head once again, however. If it was that easy, it wouldn't be here. Once one person realizes the loop is occurring, the game would be given away. Up ahead I can see far more fluctuations in time, suggesting there are a variety more layers to this trap. Each probably shortens how long you are in the loop for until you get trapped, even if you try to force your way through, resulting in your only option to be to retreat until you can find a way to punch through it. Quite clever really. It would have made Baragan's base almost inaccessible through normal means, delaying any attacks for a time to prevent large-scale surprise attacks, but then if there wasn't a way around it, then there would be no way the Hollows could reach him. They could still use Gargantes, Shinji pointed out. It would be a hassle, but it would work. I stand corrected then, Mavis muttered. Though. What is it? Gargantes leave a noticeable trace on use. Given enough time, I'm sure someone in Ishgar could learn how to stop them from reaching where they need to go, at least by stopping the dimension from being able to open up in our area. If that happened, this place could still be put under siege. I would have thought Baragan would have a method to avoid that, which I think he may do. What was it Starkey said again? Under the sands, you'll find a door. You think there's something literally under the sand? Maybe. But there would have to be a place to give us access to it. Digging around would be pointless. There is something that might be what we're looking for, Toshiro said, pointing off into the distance nearer their destination. It's further in thought, but it looks like some sort of structure. I thought it was some kind of fort, but it could be something. Mavis gave a shrug. There's a few of them scattered around, so it's worth a shot. If we're lucky, there'll be some kind of passageway down. It's far enough though that you'd need to rush to it before a reset kicks in. I'll let you know when we get looped back. When that happens, run for it as fast as you can. Protector of the Fairies. Is everyone ready? Hibiki asked, carefully listening into each confirmation before turning to Mest. All right. Looks like we're all good. Did you finish your preparations? Sitting cross-legged on the ground, Mest briefly opened his eyes and looked up to give a nod. Should be ready in a moment, he quickly said before going back to his previous stance, his hands locked together in focus. Waiting for a few more moments, he finally confirmed his own readiness. Done. On your order. All right then. Everyone, prepare for jump. Jura's forces have begun to retaliate, so we're going to move in and assist them on our end. Do it, Mest. A massive feeling of disorientation hit them all instantly, the magic that had been spread around the ship taking them all along with it. Hundreds of miles were traveled in the blink of eye, and they immediately found themselves appearing right where they needed to. That was until the entire ship began to fall again. What's happening, Mest? Hibiki screamed out, clinging to his desk as best as he could. Mest could barely answer himself, hanging off a table leg for dear life. I was off target. He screamed out in turn, panic filling his face as realization set in. Brace. Without proper visuals, they had no idea how far they had fallen from. But after a few moments of terror, the ship smashed into the ground at full force, knocking them all around from the impact. Carefully picking himself off the ground, clutching a bleeding head with one hand, Hibiki leaned against the desk before asking, "Is everyone okay?" Multiple replies came in, each containing various amounts of winces and groans, but for the most part they all seemed fine. That was a relief at least. Pulling up an archive screen to try and get the lay of the land, Hibiki's eyes widened as the color drained from his face. "Oh. That's not good." "What is it?" Mest asked, groaning himself as he clutched his side in pain. Limping over, he glanced at the screen that had shocked Hibiki into speechlessness only for his face to take on a similar expression. "Ah. So I was quite off, it appears. I thought I had the coordinates right, but margins for error always get amplified across greater distances. At least we hit the Hollow Army. We're in the wrong place though," Hibiki muttered. "Scans indicate we're right above a large hole, precariously balanced on top of it. We don't have to make a run for it at least." "That's not a bright side here," Hibiki snapped back. "The energy of the explosion will also heads downwards and will completely drown the tunnel in it. If we don't run now, we'll never make it. But we can't leave the ship undefended while the reactor charges up. God, this is the worst place we could have ended up at." "Forget about the original plan," Kisuk's voice came as he cut in. "I can ensure the reactor will blow, even the Hollows get on board. But in return we all need to flee now and make a run for it through the tunnel. Can everyone go ahead and do that?" "What about you?" Ishein's voice said as he called across the link. "What will you do to get out of there?" "Don't worry about me," Kisuk replied. "I'll catch up as quickly as I can, but it'll be easier with a clear path." "I'll stay with you," Mest said before briefly glancing at Hibiki. "You'll be able to go with the others, right, Hibiki?" The man nodded. "I'll be fine. Ishein, I'll be right there. Hang on for me a moment if you could." "Kisuk, we're counting on you." Closing the archive link down when no more responses came in, he quickly turned to Mest before placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "Make sure you both get out of there all right? We aren't after sacrificial heroes today." "We'll be as fast as we can," Mest said before rushing away, heading down towards the reactor and leaving Hibiki to meet up with the others. It didn't take long for him to find the room it was held in, doing his best to ignore the hundreds of hollow cries around them. It sounded like the others were beginning to do work to clear them away and to begin their journey down into the hole, and once they did they would have a limited window to act in before the hollows swarmed the ship. Finding an already open door to the reactor room, he quickly snuck in and found the man he was looking for. Leaning over by the reactor's core, Kisuk was carefully fiddling with a variety of small devices that he couldn't even guess about their purpose or what he was planning to use them for. It was all too complex for him, so he settled for asking instead. "How's it going? What's the plan here? The archive link is fully shut off, right?" Kisuk asked without looking back at him. Pulling a small device free from the reactor, he began fiddling with the inner workings of it and reorganizing them to suit his own plans for them. "Well. Sorry," Mest said rapidly when he realized he had just been staring at the man working. "Yes, it is." "Why?" "Because I would rather that as few people as possible know what I'm about to do," Kisuk said, fiddling with the last screw over the reactor's front before pulling a large panel loose. Seeing the innermost workings revealed a transparent sphere as tall as he was, with what he could only assume was magic densely packed inside it, flowing inside the bound area like streams of colored light. "Is that what powers everything?" he asked. He knew it was a question with an obvious answer, but the sight was too shocking to not want to hear it. "I've never seen a reactor like this before. It's impressive, but this is a phenomenon you'll find in many advanced storage systems for magic. Few though are able to hold enough magic that this becomes a common visual. Your normal type of lacrima isn't capable of showing this, but anything that is used to charge large-scale systems will exhibit this to a certain degree. And as you can imagine, there is a very large amount of magic contained within to produce this effect. And we want to detonate that, right?" Kisuk nodded. "That's going to be the hard part. Hibiki estimated this to take 5 minutes with his plan. With mine. Well, I don't know how long it'll take. It's more likely to happen faster than slower, and there lies the problem. But what are you going to do? Reaching underneath his cloak, Kisuk slowly pulled out a small orb, large enough that it could rest easily in the palm of his hand. Turning to look at Mest, he said with a serious look, "Remember, no one must know about this. Especially Ichigo." "All right." Getting a nod in return, Kisuk turned back to his work as he began fiddling with wires and attaching them around the item resting in his palm. "This device is one of my own creation. It's called the Hujioku, a device allowing one to breach barriers that would otherwise prevent access." "Like what?" "Well, it's responsible for Ichigo's hybrid state for starts, and Shinji's visored status, and even Baragan's own transformation. There are many barriers in this world that can prevent people from going beyond certain limits, and generally they resort to finding new methods to work around them. I created this specifically to utilize in my holification research when I realize I would need a way to bypass that barrier rather than merely working around it. As you can tell, I succeed. Too well. And you're going to use that to shatter this barrier?" Mest asked, getting closer to see what Kisuk was doing. "That's the plan, right?" Kisuk shook his head. "Not quite. Rather, what will do the job is what I've been storing in this device of mine. Do you remember our encounter with Avatar? This is about the magical barrier particles," Mest muttered immediately, understanding why Kisuk had been asking for secrecy so much. "Have you been using them?" "No. I'm not a fool. But I was hardly going to ignore the chance to study them. I figured if I could understand what they were, I could perhaps devise a countermeasure of some kind. A month later and I'm no closer to one than when I started, but it did lead to some interesting discoveries." Pausing for a moment, he gestured for Mest to come closer to see the orb in his hand. "See this?" he asked, pointing at the streaks of darkness within the orb. "That's a result of it storing magical barrier particles." "How has it not broken free?" Mest asked curiously. "I would have thought the shell would have collapsed against the energy." "You'd be right, but that's why there is also magic stored in here too in order to counteract that." "Ah. It remains balanced in an equilibrium." Kisuk shrugged. "Close enough. In reality the two energies are constantly at war with one another. I had to ensure the magic in the orb wrapped around where the magical barrier particles was stored in order to contain it, but even doing that has both energies being eroded by one enough. Using the reactor I've been able to constantly replenish the magic but the magical barrier particles. Well, that was when I had to use the Hujioku to get around that." Mest frowned at the answer, uncertain of what Kisuk was explaining. "How so?" "We haven't encountered any other sources of magical barrier particles until now." "Did you keep some on the ship in secret?" "Apart from this lot, I mean." A shake of the man's head gave him his answer. "No. Rather, I used the Hujioku's innate power on the world and broke down some barriers. More specifically, I broke down the barriers between the Hujioku and whatever would stop it obtaining more energy. I almost messed up and caused the energy to leak out, but by adding more magic I managed to stabilize it. Since then, there has been a constant stream of magical barrier particles entering the Hujioku at the same rate that they are destroyed it." "But, where is it coming from?" "Where indeed," Kisuk muttered. "That question has bugged me more than I'd like to admit, but there is little we can do about it right now beyond speculate. Regardless, what I plan to do here is increase the rate it takes in the magical barrier particles from the source and have it cause a chain reaction with the reactor's own internal supplies. Tests have shown that both energies get more ferocious when in contact with one another, so I expect the resulting yield of detonate to increase as a result as the two energies clashing. Which means we have until the magic holding the contained magical barrier particles back to get out of here. And this is a wise move?" Mest asked critically. "You understand that you are releasing what must be a massive quantity of magical barrier particles in the midst of the enemy. If that energy hits the barrier too, it'll strip it away, I'm aware," Kisuk stated. "But we have little options, and honestly this outcome is better than the current one. Lingering energy is less of an issue too, since the reactor's detonation will throw out enough energy to completely wipe out the magical barrier particles after their clash occurs. Have some faith." Attaching a last wire to the Hujioku, Kisuk placed it within before beginning to place the panel back over and loosely fix it in place. That'll do it anyway. I've began the process, so we need to get out of here. Still capable of teleporting us out of here? I am, Mest said as he offered out a hand for Kisuk to take. Hold on. I'll try and get us as close to the others as possible, but be aware we are jumping into uncertain territory. We'll need to be prepared to dodge the moment we appear in case we're in the way of any attacks. Just hurry up and do it, Kisuk stated, grabbing the man's hand and watching as the world around them shifted and brought them into an earth-filled tunnel. Protector of the Fairies. Another was coming. Lifting up the sheathed blade in her hands, she swung it with all her might, her own usage of gravity magic accelerating it directly into the hollow's chest. She could feel the body give way beneath her strike, but she had no time to check on the hollow's demise. The moment it was launched from her blade, she was already lunging at the hollow, reaching for one of her comrades. The sword was drawn for a brief moment, the bloodlust she felt from it filling her mind, before it was swung and immediately sheathed. That was all it took to sever the hollow's head from its body, saving her wounded friends. But there was still no time to rest. Not when there was still danger about. How many more were there? For every one she killed, another would be entering from one side of the tunnel to continue the assault. It was endless, and it had taken its toll on all of them. She had been the one to state her intentions to block the tunnel when they had realized they would lose if it remained open. So as hundreds had fled around her, she had charged instead. She had initially expected to be alone. She hadn't wanted to draw anyone into this mess with her, but she had forgotten just how strong her bonds were. Even if they had been walking into hell, Mermaid Heel had been willing to run right behind her for this cause. Those who had been too wounded from battle had fled upon her orders, and the rest that had been willing to follow her had done so, straight into the source of the hollow invasion. Momentum had a way of doing wonderful things. The hollows, drunk on their assumed victory, had been caught completely off guard when they should have been pushing their assault. And using their newly gained momentum, they pushed down as far as they could before digging in. It didn't matter what dirty tricks they needed to pull, what traps they needed to set, or how many hollows they needed to cut down. If they could hold the area, they could give those on the surface a chance. But that had never been meant to last. They could only fight so long. The tunnel had been a perfect battleground for them. There were only two ways enemies could come from, and they could watch each other's backs against the endless waves. They couldn't be hit from above or below, and the amount of hollows that could strike at any one time was far smaller than it would have been on the surface. It was a place that worked well for their small number. But then time passed, and weariness began to set in. No one could fight forever. Every action drained stamina. Every spell used magic. And there was only so many of them against an endless number of hollows. Eventually the stalemate was going to break. She had almost lost it when the first of her friends fell. That lady was kind. She had been the one that had initially welcomed her into the guild with a large smile and had offered her advice as often as she asked for it. The hollow that had torn of her arm was cut down in seconds, but it was too late to stop the blood loss. They had no way to get her to the help she needed, and her friend was dead not long after. Others fell shortly after. A new but talented girl she remembered joining almost a year ago, a woman that looked to be reaching the age of retirement but had still been as active as she had been in her youth, and even Miliana eventually fell down to the ground beside her. Not all of them were dead, she could tell that from the small signs of life she noticed from those like her cat-like friend, but they had slowly lost member after member to either crippling injuries or death. Eventually it had been just her left, in a battle she had been fighting for God knows how long. She had lost track some time ago when she had tried to throw away any distractions around her to keep her focus intact. Would help arrive soon? It had to if any of her friends still alive had any hope of surviving, and until that time occurred she had no intention of falling here. Even if it cost her an arm and a leg, she'd fight to the bitter end until help could arrive. Another roar from behind her. These hollows should really keep quiet if they wanted to surprise her. With a quick swing her sword was swatting the hollow away before she brought the sheathed sword up and carefully aimed its point towards the group of hollows rushing her from one side of the tunnel. Applying her gravity magic across its surface, she thrust the blade forward and let the energy fly, scattering them before they could make it a few feet towards her. That opening however let more hollows from behind her close the gap. Her gravity magic burst to life once more as she leapt across the gap towards them, her sword being drawn briefly to slash the first to pieces before she pulled it tightly back into its sheath. Another swing and a second hollow was sent flying like the others before it, but that time was used by the rest to draw nearer to her. They were trying to circle her, boxing her in and leaving her with no room to move around. It was a smart move, but she doubted that it would last for long with how disorganized these hollows could be. Most of their battle plans were to charge in one direction and kill anything in their path, with just enough planning to have them organized into groups for doing so. Her sheathed blade swung more as the hollows tried to close in, swatting a few of them back into their brethren as she prepared to find the point to break through in their ranks. It appeared like it would have to be towards the source of this current group, followed by a large slash to tear a way through them. She could do it though. She only had to act now. But she couldn't. Instead her focus was caught by the hollows entering the tunnel from the other side, near her injured and dead comrades. The hollows looked hungry, as most of their kind did, so she did the only thing that was natural for her. She threw herself right towards them, swinging her blade as fast as she could to cut the hollows out of the way. They were on her tail as she tore across the short distance, cleaving through the hollow even with the blade in a sheathed state, before she spun to counter the hollows from behind. There were too many this time, however. Even as she tried to push back the ones attacking, some were smart enough to sneak up from behind and attack. No matter how fast she could react, it was impossible for her at her level to guard from every possible direction, especially after fighting for so long already. A large claw ripped across her back and swatted her away in the process, sending her face first into the rocks of the tunnel wall and causing her to slowly fall back down to the ground. The hollows that tried to take that as a sign to feast on her learned not to immediately afterwards, her form becoming a blur as she shot straight up from the ground and hacked them all into pieces, her sword being shoved back into its sheath as she took down the last one. But more would be here soon. She knew that too well. Her body was slowing down, despite her best attempts to pace herself, and her magic was getting close to dry. And as much as she prided herself with her swordsmanship, there was no way she could win with it along against so many when also so exhausted. More roars could be heard closer now. They were coming again. Her eyes fell down to her sword before she gripped the hilt tightly and pulled it from the sheath. Immediately the bloodlust hit her. It was overbearing, and she knew it was the remnants of her own resentment mixed in with the resentment of all its previous wielders. It threatened to overwhelm her now that she wasn't willing to give into it like she used to control her mind rather than allowing her to control it. More so than ever she understood the need for one to possess a strong will to use this blade and how much resolve the original wielder must have had to be able to seal this blade away into its sheath when so overwhelmed by it. Did she have a strong enough will to withstand this? That didn't matter. Right now she needed to protect those that had willingly followed her into this death trap. And if that meant enduring all this resentment hanging over her head from the blade, then so be it. The sheath fell from her grasp as she moved to hold the hilt of the blade with both hands, abandoning all options of backing away. This was her last stand right now, and if she was going to take it then she'd do it with no regrets about what she could have done to prevent this. More hollows arrived but she was more than ready for them. With each that approached she held nothing back, darting from one side of where her friends were to the other and cutting down any hollows that dared approach. 1 became 2, then 4, then 8 until she eventually lost interest in counting the hollows she had brought down. Her mind instead focused on what little magic she had left, feeling it draining at an alarming rate but being helpless to prevent it. A lucky blow hit her on the side, leaving a deep gash that stretched across onto her chest, but the large release of a gravity wave from her blade tore entire rows of hollows into pieces. Others tried to take advantage of her weakness and she quickly taught them how unwise it was, only to get caught by a hollow's claw against her head near the end when she underestimated its reach. Blood was already beginning to cloud her vision but it wasn't enough to stop her from cutting down the hollow in front of her. Odd. Their numbers, they seemed lower. Like they were fewer hollows approaching from one side. She couldn't focus on that for long though, her blade slicing through hollow after hollow that continued to approach her. Would her body give out first? Or would her magic? In the end it was neither. A hollow that she had recognized to be different stepped up, its eyes showing far more intelligence to them than any other hollow she had faced thus far. And its speed outstripped those of its allies too. Her blade had swung and met the slash of one of its arms, odd appendixes that had been shaped into points at the end, only for her blade to dig halfway in and snap in two. Her shock hadn't had time to set in when she immediately swung round again, pouring more magic than she thought necessary into the broken blade and releasing it directly up at the hollow's face. The result forced its mask into its skull and shattered it, but it was too late for her blade. She hadn't even noticed when it had started getting chipped. She had killed so many hollows since this started that she hadn't even been aware that it had been accumulating damage every time she had drawn it to cut down more enemies. However, despite the result being before her eyes, she didn't care. Instead, she reached down and pulled the longer blade piece from the hollow she had killed, holding it tightly in her other hand and ignoring the feeling of blood being drawn from its edge. More hollows fell, but it wasn't the same. She might have had two blades now, but neither was as long as her original blade. The blade had broken a quarter of the way up from the hilt, and she was making the best she could out of that shorter piece by using her gravity magic to release waves of force with each strike. Her other blade meanwhile could afford none of that and instead had to rely on the longer reach to keep foes back. With two weakened weapons like this, it was no surprise when she started taking more injuries. A misstep here that resulting in another cut across her body, a slow response here that resulting in a large blow striking her back. Each attack only added more pressure onto her diminishing abilities until finally, as she swung her small blade at a nearby hollow, her magic failed her. She was out. Completely dry. It had been a miracle she lasted as long as she had, but now? Now it was all over. The hollow lunged at her and she felt teeth bit down on her shoulder, a scream of pain being released through her throat as she was forced down onto her back. Even so, she continued to try and fight, stabbing the shorter blade into the back of the hollow's head deep enough for it to pierce the mask. The hollow's body began to fade around her as she pushed off its disappearing body, barely able to keep her eyes open and trying to use the pain as adrenaline. She forced her eyes to meet those of the hollows surrounding her, daring them to try and attack and that she'd strike them all down in turn despite her state. And for some she was sure it worked. They were obviously intelligent enough to know how dangerous a wondered animal could be when they had nothing left to lose. But others knew as well as she did that she was on her last legs. She could barely keep herself awake, and she doubted she'd be getting back up if she fell again. The hollows charged as she made her last stand. Her sword began to swing, but her step forward was too weak, her body finally giving up on her as she fell. But rather than feeling the embrace of death, she felt another instead, a pair of arms grabbing her before she could hit the ground. Her eyes glanced up weakly to see the hollows falling, her savior holding a sword down in one hand while gripping her with his other. Other mages were there too, ones she didn't know and ones she did. And even one she recognized personally. "We did it," she muttered as she willingly surrendered to the sweet comfort of the darkness. "We made it." Protector of the Fairies. The first thing Kisuk noticed as he appeared was that he was standing on something soft. Glancing down, he realized immediately it wasn't a hollow and was instead human. Another moment passed and he had already confirmed that the woman they had appeared on was dead, large claw marks across her chest that revealed the bones within. Kisuk. His attention turned towards the voice to see Ishain supporting a woman on his shoulders, a broken sword hanging tightly in one of her hands. The other piece of the blade appeared to have been dug into the woman's flesh, her grip on it, even in her unconscious state, forcing it to remain in place. "Did everything go all right on the ship?" "It's all fine," Kisuk said, taking stock of the situation around them. "How about you? What is this?" "Mermaid heel," Karen said before Ishain could, her voice sounding like it was broken to his ears. "Ah, this was the guild she was a part of, wasn't it? No wonder she sounded like that. These were my friends." "We can't stay," Ishain said to her, doing his best to try and comfort her while still stressing the urgency they were facing. "Some are still alive, so grab who you can and let's move. We can't afford to stay here." "How long do we have?" Hibiki asked Kisuk as he approached, one of the smaller members of the guild being carried on his back. "Any idea?" Kisuk shrugged. "Not sure. It'll happen soon though. So we should get a move on so we can be out of here before it happens." "How many are still alive down here?" "Not many," Hibiki replied quietly. "Grab as many as you can. We can't do a second trip, so we need to take as many as we can." He turned to repeat the same test only to find the man had already rushed towards one of the women still alive and carefully pulling her onto his back. Kisuk quickly matched the others, pulling too tightly onto his back while Ishine went and grabbed more and slung them under his arms. The only one left without any was Gray, standing at the head of the group with his hands exposed. "I'll clear the way," he called back before charging forward, meeting a rush of hollows from the other side and freezing each one with the touch of his palms. When they tried to block his path with their bodies, he instead swung out and released larger waves of ice to freeze them all solid, immediately shattering them by leaping through to clear a path for those behind him. They were almost there when they heard the first sounds of rumbling. Not one looked back as they picked up their pace, the sound drawing closer with every moment as light began to appear before them. With last bursts of speed, they all pushed forward as fast as they could. Some used Shunpo to dash forward that last bit, pulling others with them. Others tried to propel themselves forward with whatever means they had or to dart out of the hole as fast as they could. In the end, they barely made it, the last of them landing on the edge of the hole and falling forward just before a torrent of energy tore upwards out of the hole and scattered them all with its shock waves. Being the closest to the blast, Hibiki had it the worst, being flung across the ground while trying to hold the girl he had managed to rescue against him to avoid having her flung away in the process. A hollow was fast to try and take advantage of his weakness only for a wave of flames to burn it to a crisp before it could. "Over here!" A familiar voice called out, Natsu dropping from the sky and landing beside them as other familiar mages appeared. Mages from Fairy Tail, mages from Lamia Scale, mages from Quattro Cerberus, mages from Blue Pegasus, they were all present and Hibiki quickly found his fellow Trimens reaching his side with helping hands. A look over at the battle revealed that their forces were pushing their way through, more and more displays of familiar magic showing up as guilds united and pushed back the Hollow Army. The barrier had been shattered in a large area, but as the energy from the explosion cleared, the Hollow Army beyond it looked to be in tatters. "Hibiki, can you take these girls back?" Ishine asked him as he approached, depositing the mermaid heel mages in the hands of the Trimen before turning his attention towards the Hollow Army still remaining. "I'm going to do my job and push the remaining hollows back out of the barrier." "That's fine," he replied, looking curiously at the man. "But how do you plan to do that? What's your plan?" "Plan?" Ishine shrugged half-heartedly. "Haven't got much of one, but there's always something a Shinigami like myself falls back on in times like this." He tapped his sword as if giving an answer before saying his solution. "Call Byakuya here. Tell him I'm going to use my Bankai. Protector of the Fairies. Those awaiting in the land of sand." "So this is what that hint meant," Miss Doggin said in amazement, staring up at the 5 large gateways before them. "Under the sands, you'll find a door." "Well, in this case, it appears there are multiple." "There are many paths," Mavis said, parroting out the words Starkey had told them. "But the only one you should take is back. Only by retreating can you find the way forward." "Does that mean we go back? Does it look like there are any traps ahead of us?" Ichigo asked, Mavis slowly shaking her head in response. "Not that I can see, but there is definitely some kind of time magic at play nearby. Some kind of other magic too if I focus, but it's hard to pinpoint." "So do we pick a path?" Taoshiro asked. "Or shall we head back like the message said? Going back could be a trap to waste our time." "Maybe not," Shinji pointed out, one hand resting under his chin as he looked at each path before looking back the way they had come from. "Depending on how one looks at things, they can become distorted and reveal something different. You assume that the paths that appear here are faster when in reality it may be that taking a step back can reveal a shorter route. You want to double check?" "There was hardly anything there." "Then we obviously missed something or something slipped our perception," Shinji countered. It was true that the area they had first arrived in after breaching the building in the desert had been void of anything but a ladder down, and that the room it took them into was just as barren apart from a few torches lighting the way, but that also made it easier to overlook something since they hadn't expected much. When there is nothing to see, one can easily assume that what is hidden is not there. But that isn't always true. And as if to prove his point, Shinji turned around on the spot and began walking back down the corridor. "Hey! Shinji! It's worth a shot, right?" Shinji called back, throwing a smirk over his shoulder as he dared them to follow him. Naturally they all did. None of them had any other solutions right now, so they'd try anything if one of them could think of something smart enough. After a few minutes of walking, however, something became very apparent to all of them. "This isn't the same place," Mavis stated, her eyes scanning around them as if trying to unravel the mystery hidden in the walls. "We crossed some kind of threshold, I think. The energy is different here. More saturated and active. Like the state it was at in Tartaros and Waiwaka's palace." "So can we assume we made it then?" Shinji asked confidently. "Barragan's palace, Las Noches. Any idea what trick they just pulled?" "I felt something. It felt familiar, in fact. Like a miniature Garganta. Is it possible? Maybe. Could have been layered over the path and set to trigger upon certain actions. Traps within traps, each possessing a way for Barragan's allies to slip past in case they are caught up in them. This one cut off a lot of travel time for us, putting us right in the fortress, but I'm still not sure where Barragan is." "He'll be easy to find," Ichigo stated, his eyes tracking the energy around him before reaching out a hand towards it. It seemed to shiver to his eyes for a moment before settling into his hand, as if seeking warmth from it before slowly floating away once again. "Magic feels odd here. It's like it's afraid, or rather wary. But I think I should be able to follow this trace to Barragan if need be." "Can he do the same?" Taoshiro asked. "We don't want to lose our element of surprise if we can. It'll be better if we can catch him before he can prepare. That's what this cloak is doing. It'll keep me hidden for a bit longer until we reach him, provided we don't encounter any trouble along the way." Pausing in mid-step, the others halting with him and turning to follow his gaze, he added, "I think we are at least going to learn whether or not we should have trusted Starkey now," as he noticed the hollow in question standing at the end of the hallway. Lazily raising a hand, the adult male-looking hollow let out a loud yawn, covering his mouth with one hand and closing his eyes tiredly for a few moments. "You took your time," he said as Ichigo began to slowly approach him again, backed up by the others. "I was wondering if you were even going to show up or not, or even if your friend passed on my message. It seems he did by the look of things and by the fact that you're here today of all days." "Your message turned out to be helpful," Ichigo said carefully, making sure that Starkey could see that one of his hands was resting on the hilt of his smaller blade. "So? What's your play here? We can't just trust you because you sent us a helpful message. Not when you're important enough that Barragan would take you with him to declare war on us. What are you trying to get out of this? Sleep?" At the looks of disbelief he got, Starkey let out another yawn before giving his head a little shake. "I'm being honest. I don't want anything really beyond Barragan being defeated. Maybe for you lot to ignore me as I leave afterwards, but really I don't want anything. I was happy with my life before, so long as Lilynet was with me, and if we wish to now we can always blend in with you humans thanks to becoming Aaron cars. So I really have nothing beyond trying to gain that freedom in this fight, something I had before, and it's not anything that would negatively impact you either. I just want some peace and quiet to live my life in. Which would give me plenty of time to lounge around for days on end if I wish. You went turncoat, for a chance to be able to sleep when you want." Taoshiro muttered in absolute disbelief. "You have to be kidding me. That's your entire goal in all of this? You want me to have some noble goal?" Starkey shrugged. "I guess preventing more unnecessary fighting would be nice. I'd just honestly like it if the world went back to how it was before this all started and before Barragan starting causing trouble for us. I was happy with that life, so there isn't anything wrong with wishing for it back, is there?" "Not at all," said Ichigo before Taoshiro could express more of his disbelief. "Though you're sure you're willing to work with us for this? If we fail, you'll be brought down with us. If you fail, it'll only be a matter of time until I die anyway. Barragan's desire for revenge will eventually bring about my own death, whether by his own hand or by the hands of another when I'm forced to do a mission I can't complete. Better now, when the odds are in our favor, than later, when this advantage here is gone." Pausing for a moment, his hand patting the sword by his side for a moment in confusion, he muttered quietly, "All right, I'll hurry up." "You talking to someone?" Miss Doggin asked critically, his hands still gripping his spear tightly and keeping himself ready to attack at a moment's notice. "Are you sure you aren't just trying to lure us into a trap?" "No, he's legit," Shinji said, his eyes having never left Stark once until now. "He's not lying. He's either hidden the truth well behind a facade of other truths or he's honestly here to help. Considering past experience, I'd say it's the latter." "The question is probably still worth answering," Ichigo pointed out, looking at Stark curiously. "Is it that girl with you? What was her name again?" "Lilynet." "Ah, that was it. Was it her?" Stark nodded. "She's special to me. I have her keeping an eye on the path up ahead and she's warning me in case she sees any difficulties appearing. There is nothing yet but the other two hollows here beside Baragan are bound to question my disappearance sooner or later. If we are going to get moving, we should do it now." Glancing at his friends for a moment, Ichigo quickly took in their reactions about the idea before replying. "Fine then. For the time being we'll work together. Let's hope this partnership turns out to be good for us." "Protector of the Fairies. You called for me?" Byakuya asked, coming to a stop beside a resting Ishine. Looking around he could see no hollows within 100 meters of the man, a mountain of burnt corpses surrounding him. "I see you've been busy. Had to pass the time somehow," Ishine stated, pushing himself up to his feet and letting his sword fall back down to hang by his side. "Did you get the messages from Hibiki? Our forces are moving away from the main bulk of the enemy's forces as you requested," Byakuya replied. "I hope you are ready to hold this gap by yourself." "Well, I'm not sure I can handle this completely alone," Ishine said as he chuckled, glancing at Byakuya pointedly. "Mind setting up a barrier with your Zanpakuta to stop my flames spreading to our own forces? I will need to use my Bankai to create the quantity of blade fragments necessary for what you are asking. Is that a yes or a no?" Byakuya sighed, drawing his blade before letting it fall to the ground. Bankai. Hundreds of large swords stretched back up from the ground as the blade sank into it, shattering into an uncountable number of blade fragments to Ishine's eyes. He watched it just long enough to see Byakuya beginning to direct the blades towards where he needed them before he turned to his own blade. "A lot of blood's been spilled here today," he said, holding up his Zanpakuta to eye level as he watched the blood from the hollows drip off its surface and onto the ground. "So many people must have died. But it is only because of that tragedy that we might avert another. Isn't that right, Injetsu?" He chuckled dryly at the response he could hear from his Zanpakuta. "Aye, morbid as even in these moments. Well then, let's do this, old friend. Let's give the fallen a proper send-off." Tilting the sword, he dug it down into the ground, allowing the blade to sink into a pool of blood at his feet. Bankai. At once the pool of blood vanished, replaced by a surface of flames that stretched up and surrounded his Zanpakuta. Slowly lifting the blade back out, the flames licking his skin harmlessly as they neared, he gave a brief nod towards Byakuya before heading towards the hollows nearby. With Byakuya's Bankai up, they would quickly see the easiest way forward was through him, a single man standing alone. And soon those roars turned towards him and thousands of hollows were being funneled towards him, all traveling across the field of death they had already created. "Burn them all," Ishine muttered, raising his sword up as the flames increased around his blade. "Make a sea of flames and send off our brave soldiers to the next world. And let this pyre of ours show to them our thanks for their sacrifice." With a swing of his sword, the entire area before he became consumed by a wave of flames. He continued to walk through them unafraid, the flames parting around him, as the wave spread forward, no longer restrained by his own magical power and instead finding fuel from the one other source it could on the battlefield. The blood. He had never been sure if he saw his Zanpakuta's ability as one he liked. In Shikai he could turn his own blood into fuel for his flames, allowing him to turn the tide of a disastrous battle if his blood had been spilt too much or to shape his attacks in ways that would be hard for the enemy to handle. His Bankai however took a different approach. It wasn't his blood that was combustible anymore but all other blood. A single cut from his blade would send the enemy's blood on fire from within, burning them up from the inside, while a battlefield filled of death could be overrun by a sea of flames that would last until the blood was completely drained. A Bankai that could give someone no chance after a single strike and became its most dangerous with the death of many. How could he say he outright that he liked such a power knowing that it was impossible, but he also knew he couldn't dislike such a power when it was the reason he could save more now. It let him turn the sacrifice of those that had fallen into his own strength for the sake of others. He doubted this would decide such a battle, however. With the large hole in the barrier, it wouldn't take long for many of the hollows to realize the safest option was to retreat. That was in their best interests really, but he hoped he could take as many down before that as he could. Then there was the matter of the espada. As much as he would like it to, he knew this sea of flames wouldn't kill them. And breaking through Byakuya's sword barrier would be a piece of cake for them, with how thin it must be to merely provide a barrier against his flames. Frowning, he noticed the familiar sensation of someone he had fought before. A hollow, it seemed. That same one he had fought on the first few days of the war, to be precise. It was heading towards him rapidly. Had it worked out he was the source of these flames and wanted to take him down to halt the spread, he'd have to disappoint the hollow. He had no way to stop the flames anymore now that they were consuming blood to fuel themselves, but he'd certainly keep it company if it so wished. Increasing his pace, he felt his body begin to heat up, as if a fire had been lit inside his body. It seemed it had already begun. Everything was becoming much clearer, but he knew that would only last for so long. Better hurry and deal with all this, he muttered, rushing more urgently towards the incoming hollow in the hopes to settle the matter quickly and move on to any other enemies. Before I burn up from the inside myself. Protector of the fairies. Damn, Starkey muttered, finishing talking to the green-haired hollow girl they had met up with before resting a hand on her head to keep her in place, much to her annoyance if her squirming was anything to go by. All right, we might have a problem. And here it is, muttered Toshiro. I told you something like this would happen. It's not all bad, Starkey assured him. Just an unexpected issue. Haribel seems to have noticed that something is up and has been increasing her patrols around the area. Part of her route puts her right in our own path in a few minutes from here if we're unlucky, and even if we get past we won't be clear of her. Her position puts her close enough that she'll be able to reach Baragan faster than we can defeat him, even if we are all working together. She needs to be defeated if we stand a chance at this. Delayed at the very least. You said she was the third strongest espada, right? Yeah. The only people stronger than her are myself, Ulquiorra and Baragan. Haribel's dangerous, Lilynet added in support. She creates a ton of water and uses it to crush people. She shivered for a moment as a memory flashed across his mind. She used it a lot when she got annoyed to make people shut up. I don't even want to imagine what she is like when serious or in her resurrection. Water, huh? Muttered Shinji, glancing at Toshiro with a smirk. Think you can handle her? I should be able to, Toshiro stated. It depends a bit under what principle her ability works under, but I'm confident in my Bankai's power when it comes down to it. Worst case, I'll be delayed for a bit until my Bankai's full power is unleashed, at which point I'll be able to finish it as quickly as I can and regroup in that state. That'll be helpful, Ichigo admitted. I doubt you'd have the time to wait it out against Baragan. You sure you'll be okay with this by yourself? I'm sure. Now hurry. You don't want to miss your chance to slip past. Watching as they sped ahead, Toshiro waited until they were out of sight before opening up his senses and finding the hollow he was looking for. His feet took him the way he needed to go, pulling him around corridor after corridor until he found himself in a wide open room, one with large pillars that supported the ceiling along with elaborate staircases and other pieces of architecture. You don't belong here. And there she was. Standing at the other side of the large room he had entered, looking more like it might have been a greeting room of some kind. He could see large pair of double doors near the edge of the room, so it appeared the thoughts might have more weight than he had thought. His attention remained on the hollow for the most part, however, taking in her dark skin and long blonde hair, pulled back into thin bundles that hung down behind her. A small but thick sword rested horizontally across her back, still sheathed for the time being for some odd reason. He would have expected a more aggressive response, being an invader and all. Toshiro Hitsuguya, am I right? She asked, the expression on her face not changing as she did so. She seemed so, passive seemed the best word for it in his mind. No, even that wasn't right. It was more like acceptance, either of what she had to do or what the outcome of said result would be. You match the reports we have of important war assets of Ishgar. That's my name, yeah, Toshiro admitted, restraining the urge to draw his sword for the moment. No point fighting immediately if he could help it. It would keep the element of surprise for longer for when the others reached Baragan. And yours? It's a bit odd for me if I have to call you Hollow all the time, especially with that appearance of yours. The Hollow nodded in understanding. Tier Haribal, rank 3 Espada. But I'm sure you must have known some of this. Did Starkey not inform you? Starkey. She knew. She somehow knew. Unless she was bluffing. If she was, it meant she didn't know anything. He just had to act like he didn't know anything. Who is that? A look of disappointment appeared across the Hollow's face for a moment before returning to her look of acceptance. I know you're working with him. I suspected for the longest time that he would plan something. He liked his life from before far too much to not be willing to act. And even if he wasn't bothered about that, he would have done so anyway for Lilynet's sake. He would never be able to bear seeing her die in this war. Still don't know what you're talking about. You would never have been able to infiltrate this place as quietly as you did without inside help, the Hollow said in response to his attempts to lie. And only Hollows that Baragan trusts or can count on know about the secret ways through the barriers in place. And when I look at who might betray us, Starkey is the only one I can think of that would do so by working with you all. She paused for a moment, a thought occurring in her mind before adding, Nell might have done so too, but she cannot maintain her true self long enough to get you all to trust her. Far more likely that the individual was one like Starkey, who holds both impressive enough power to help fight Baragan but who also would have the means to get you all here. I suppose however that this is enough talking, she added, one hand slowly coming up to her sword and slipping a finger through the hoop on its end. Pulling the blade free and letting it swing for a moment, yellow light filling up the hollow space within the blade, she finally brought it to a stop and pointed it at him. I will do my duty as is expected of me and stop you here. Prepare yourself, Shinigami. This will be my one and only warning. Protector of the Fairies. Another enemy? I thought you said this route would avoid them. It should have done, muttered Starkey. Something's wrong. Ulquiorra should not be here. The chance of this happening is too suspicious. Baragan knows something. He has to. But how? Isn't it obvious? Shinji asked in annoyance. He obviously read your intentions. You must have given away your true feelings on his actions and drawn his attention enough so that he began to keep an eye on you. He might have just been waiting for you to make a move so he could get as much use out of you first of all. That sounds like Gramps, Lilynet muttered. He would do that. They shouldn't be tracking us though, Ichigo pointed out, tugging the edge of his cloak further around him. Ulquiorra must have worked out the route you were taking based on your position and moved to block you off. If some of us were to sneak round another way, we could bypass him entirely. That would work, Starkey muttered, glancing round the corner briefly to check Ulquiorra was still there before sighing. Head back the way we came and take the first left. Follow the corridor to the end and take 2 rights and a left. You'll find a staircase up there which will take you towards the top of one of the towers. From there you'll have a direct line of sight towards Baragan, which you'll be able to use to either rush him or try and pick him off at distance while you have the chance. I'll do my best to hold Ulquiorra here. You sure you'll be able to do that? Ulquiorra is the strongest Espada, right? Aye. If we are talking about strength, he is supposedly stronger than myself. He doesn't seem like it, Shinji pointed out. Can't you feel his magical power? It's weaker than yours. By a lot. What makes him so much stronger? We don't know, Lilynet said as Starkey shrugged. Gramps though didn't always hold Ulquiorra so high in regard. He was once only the 3rd Espada. Then suddenly one day Gramps promoted him right above Starkey and no one knew why. Most figure he learned some ability of some kind that made him so invaluable that he instantly gained Gramps' favor. Others thought he might have been suppressing his true power and tried to make a power move on Gramps. When that failed, they said he must have been so impressive that Gramps spared him so he could use his power in the coming war. The point is, no one knows, Starkey added. Baragan met Ulquiorra in private one day, and then they left. I felt something in the distance, an incredibly powerful amount of magical power, so there might have been a fight that forced Baragan to get serious. But this is all guesswork on our part. No one else but those two were there, and so no one else knows what occurred that day. So you aren't sure if you'll be able to win if there is any sort of truth to his rumored strength, Ichigo muttered. Depending on how long the battle goes on with Baragan, we could be some time. I doubt a surprise attack would end things so quickly if he is this prepared for all of us. And if Ulquiorra was to interfere halfway through, it could cause problems. We'd need him tied up down here for a while at least, or preferably killed to prevent any interference from him whatsoever. The answer's obvious, Miss Doggin said, speaking up. Starkey will just need assistance in this fight. Allow me to stay behind. I can provide support and assist him to the best of my ability. If we're talking support, Shinji pointed out, then I'm obviously the best choice. Besides, I have previous business with this hollow. It wanted to kill me once, remember. I'd advise against that, Starkey said to Shinji as he shook his head. Your ability is well known to us hollows. There are standard orders among the high-ranking hollows to bring your corpse to Baragan, for reasons I've never been given. He wants something from you and as such made sure we would know how to fight you. The secrets of your Shikai are known to us, and any hollow at the level of the 4th Espada and above would be capable of successfully putting those tactics to use against you. I can still create openings. This isn't a one-on-one battle. Ulquiorra will be too aware of the danger you pose from the start, however. And there is a chance he might even drag the battle out longer if he knows you are here to prevent you getting any chance at leaving quickly to assist Ichigo. No, you should head towards Baragan with him. Miss Doggin and I together should have enough power to defeat Ulquiorra regardless of what secrets he has. But dash. You heard him, Shinji, said Ichigo, crossing his arms at the annoyed look that was shot at him. Didn't you say you came here to help me? Then do that and follow me. Even if the enemy is aware of your abilities, when combined with my speed we don't need them to be unaware. If you can create an opening for even a second, I'm more than fast enough to take advantage of it. You know I am. Sighing, Shinji dropped his protests. Well, I suppose I can get my answers from the old bastard at least. All right, let's go. Miss Doggin, best of luck to you. Reaching out a hand towards his fellow mage, he threw on what probably looked as an attempt of being reassuring and trying to show faith in his fellow mage to someone that might not know him. So when Miss Doggin grabbed the outstretched hand, he wasn't surprised when he was pulled down slightly, far enough that his head blocked out the front of Shinji's from Starkey's view. Be careful, Shinji whispered to him. Coincidences and traps can look almost identical. If Starkey shows even the slightest bit of hostility, flee. You won't be able to beat both of them. Raising his voice so that the others could hear him, he added, be careful. We don't want to see you die after all this. Miss Doggin threw on a reassuring smile of his own, letting Shinji's words remain in the forefront of his mind. Same for you. Keep Ichigo safe. Splitting up, the two groups separated. Miss Doggin and Starkey had no time to waste on watching their allies leave, instead heading round the corner to the large open space that Ulquiorra was waiting in. Only Lilynet remained where they had been standing, hiding until called. The hollow was waiting for them as they entered the room, standing at the top of a long flight of stairs that reached an opening to the outside behind him. He didn't look surprised or smug at their arrival. Just bored, as if this was something that couldn't even be considered a way of passing time. You finally arrived, Ulquiorra said towards Starkey, taking the steps one by one as he made his descent. I had my doubts, to be perfectly honest. Your magical power was easy to track, but those meant to be with you was another matter. Glancing briefly at Miss Doggin, he added, and I suppose by his presence it means Ichigo Kurosaki is taking another route to Lord Baragan? You do not need answer. I do not need one. So you're Ulquiorra, Miss Doggin said, readying his spear in case of any trouble. His magic was already within his grasp, just waiting to be called upon, but doing so would immediately confirm any suspicions that Baragan had at their arrival. Even if he knew they were here, he'd rather not have that confirmed completely until the moment Ichigo and the others struck. He doubted he'd get that chance to do that though, and so had to be ready at any moment. He didn't have any idea how fast this hollow might be after all. I've heard about you. You have not heard much. The contact time any of you have had with me has been minimal. Not enough to learn anything of concrete. Your time with Stark would have provided you with nothing of value that I could have risked losing either. Is he always like this? Mist Ogden muttered, glancing at Stark for a brief moment. He almost paid for it when a hand shot towards him, Ulquiorra suddenly in front of him and thrusting towards his heart with his hand. Meteor bust to life around his body and his spear spun round with that enhanced speed to deflect the arm away. Stark's sword was immediately drawn and slashing out at the other hollow only to be blocked as Ulquiorra pulled his own sword from its sheath. So we aren't allowed to even get distracted, huh? Mist Ogden muttered, letting his magic flare out. Guess there was no time to try and stay quiet against a foe like this. Fine. We'll do this the hard way. Protector of the Fairies. There he is, Shinji said, eyeing the old man in the distance on the top of Las Noches. Doesn't look as intimidating from up here. Ichigo shook his head at this words. You don't see him as I do. He's surrounded himself with so much magic that if someone was to even step foot on that roof, he'd notice the disturbance it would cause. A good way to watch out for assassins admittedly, but bad for us. Glancing around, he couldn't see any way they could get to him without him noticing. The roof curved up like dome for most of it, however at the top it had flattened out, pillars stretched up that connected to nothing before a large throne that the man was resting on. Somehow he was sure that sight was meant to mean something to him, and yet for the life of him he couldn't work out what that should be. Pausing for a moment as he sensed the clashing energies from Toshiro and Mist Ogden, he let out a sigh as he turned towards Shinji. He'll definitely know we're here, so now he's just waiting. His guard is too high right now for us to wait for an opening. How quickly do you think you can charge up a Zero? Which kind? A normal Zero or a Gran Ray Zero? The latter. Shinji shrugged. Long enough that he'd notice. I'd probably need a few seconds if I rushed things. It'll make the Zero a bit more unstable, but I'm fairly confident in my aim even in such a state. If you want me to hit Baragan with it, however, I'll need to see him fight for a few minutes first. I need to be able to predict his movements to ensure I can work out how he'll try and dodge the Zero and to ensure it distorts itself in the right direction. Alright then, Ichigo said before crouching near the edge of the tower and getting ready to leap off it. I'll stay in Shikai for the time being. Hopefully that'll encourage him to stay in his base state too. It'll be easier for the attack to wound him in such a state, and once you attack I'll unleash my Bankai and move straight in for the kill. When you say your Bankai, my true Bankai, I'll be limited on certain directions I can strike in if I don't want to hurt any of you lot, but if I time it right then Baragan will be completely unprepared for my sudden increase in speed. I'll keep him distracted, you create the large opening, and I'll cut him down before he can even release his resurrection. Sound good to you? So long as you're careful, that's fine. Best of luck to you. Nodding at the words, Ichigo leapt off the tower, shooting down towards the top of Las Noches with both swords being drawn. The cloak around him was quickly pulled back into its resting place in the pall drawn over his shoulder, freely allowing Baragan to sense his magical power finally. And if his power was going to be sensed, he'd let Baragan notice all of it at once. The larger of his two blades rose as he rushed down, energy pouring forth around it and engulfing it until a massive overlay of the original blade surrounded it. Getchuga! Baragan had noticed, and was already stepping out of his throne. The bones that made up the man's throne, oddly fitting considering the cryptic message Stark gave them, began to be pulled up with him into a new shape, condensing together until they formed a large doubled-headed battle axe that the hollow seemed to hold easily on one hand. Tenshou! The massive wave of energy flew forth as he swung his blade down, an opening for the series of attacks he planned to rain down on Baragan one after the other. He hadn't expected it to work in the slightest with how on guard Baragan was, but he also hadn't expected for Baragan to respond to his attack by merely swinging his axe at it, a wave of purple mist being released and slamming into the attack in turn. Despite the significant difference in scale, the mist broke through the entire middle of his attack before fading away, its energy obviously spent, and leaving the rest of the Getchuga Tenshou's energy to slam down harmlessly at either side of Baragan. What kind of attack was that? It definitely wasn't as strong as his own. Perhaps it was an attack designed to pierce through enemies rather than obliterate them? In that case he'd have to be far faster with his Getchuga-Ten's house or pack them with far more energy to prevent Baragan from neutralizing them each time with that attack. Landing on the surface of the roof, the ground caving slightly from the force, he eyed Baragan briefly as the man brought his axe back down to his side. The speed he had swung that axe with a single hand was definitely something to watch out for, and from looking at the man's muscles he doubted he could block the blows from that axe with his smaller blade. Even deflections might be hard, so he'd either have to dodge or try and use the larger blade to handle those blows. "So we meet again, Ichigo Kurosaki." Was that excitement in Baragan's voice? "I've been waiting for this for a long time now. Even holding myself back when we last met at the Magic Council was difficult with Wiwak and Zeref present. But now here you are before me, without any of them there to hold me back." "I believe this is the second time we've crossed paths in person," Ichigo replied. "Might not have occurred at all if you hadn't caused the Magic Council to act against you in the first place all of those years ago. Our actions were hardly the worst out there, and ones that have committed far more heinous crimes have had to suffer with far less severe fates compared to those that my guild suffered. The only reason I'm glad I wasn't there the day you slaughtered my guild was because it meant I would have this chance to get revenge, and I have been waiting for it for a long time. Dealing with that med scientist to transform me into an Aaron car, taking over Hueco Mundo to gather an army, converting those we captured into more hollows dash. So that's why you were attacking villages," Ichigo said with a snarl. "You've been turning them into your own soldiers." Baragan nodded, letting some of his anger fade to show an arrogant smirk across his face instead. "Does that annoy you? Innocence being sacrificed by the actions of another. Your guild was not innocent. That's your point of view. And this is mine. If I had to turn a few thousands of humans into hollows to fuel my revenge, then it's a worthy trade to honor the sacrifice on my fallen friends. But I suppose neither of will be able to agree on that, so why waste time talking? I have been waiting for this for a long time, and now that you're here I don't think I can hold myself back any further. We are both standing on the same stage after all. We both possess the power of Ukin, both possess the full capabilities that our powers provide us, which means finally you are strong enough for me to enjoy this. It would have been pointless if you hadn't been able to put up a fight. You need to struggle for me to get the most enjoyment out of this, and you need to make me work for it in order for it to be the most satisfying that it can be." Raising his axe once more, Baragan pointed it directly at Ichigo. "So throw at me all the power you possess. I have been waiting for this day. Once you were stronger than me, then when I finally caught up I went so far beyond that I realized I had to wait longer for the battle I wished for. Now that this time has arrived, I will not accept anything less than you throwing your all at me. Here I am, the man who started a war all to kill you and have sacrificed thousands upon thousands for that goal. So don't be shy. Go ahead and do what you did to the rest of my guild. Try and take my life from me. Protector of the fairies. A beautiful dream." Something felt wrong. She wasn't sure how long she had been feeling like this for, nor when it had even started. The days seem like blurs sometimes, but then so supposed that was what it was like when you felt this happy. By the time night came, she even sometimes found herself wondering where all the time had gone. Even so, there was always a nagging bit of doubt in her mind. Something trying to remind her of something, or perhaps trying to make her draw her eyes. But with each day it was becoming far easier to ignore. In the past such thoughts could have plagued her whole evening, hours being lost as she struggled for that tiny thread in the back of her mind. Nowadays it only lasted for a few odd seconds, a constant reminder but never for long. Glancing up at the sky as the feeling began to fade, she noticed it was already getting quite late. The sun was already beginning to set, bathing the town she called home in a warm orange light. The sight was always one she enjoyed watching, a final bit of beauty from the world before it faded into pure darkness until the next day. The usually bustling streets were always so much more peaceful, with a few familiar faces she recognized walking back home themselves and giving her a wave as they passed. Realizing she should keep moving before too much time slipped away from her, she quickly began to hurry down the path, heading towards the nearby pack she could see in the distance. It was such a lovely place in the summer she felt, but with them already so far into fall there were hardly any leaves left on the trees. Winter would be here soon and it wouldn't be as nice to look at unless it snowed, something she admittedly wouldn't mind. Seeing fields of pure white, untouched by life for a time, was a calming sight sometimes. And she knew her husband loved seeing the sight, even if he ended up crying every time. Getting married. She hadn't thought she would have ever done that. It was a strange thought, and for the longest time she had doubts whether or not she was even suited for it. She had been alone for so long, and when she finally had people to count on, she had dedicated herself to them as a knight. And then after that, she had let herself fall into the same trap. Even stepping a foot out of what she had always known had been scary to think about, but this had been far further beyond that. But as much as it had scared her, she hadn't said no. She had wanted to move past her old self and chase after the things she had always wanted but hesitated at reaching for. And it had all been worth it in the end. They'd had a few rough patches here and there, neither had been very sure of what to do, and they had fought about some things she could only think were silly now. But overall, she was happy. It hadn't been exactly what she expected, but that in itself had probably made it better. And then she came along. Seeing a familiar bench in the distance, she immediately spotted the young girl with the same shade of green hair as her own, lying with her back against the wood and staring up at the open sky. She always did have a habit of doing that on days like this. She said the sky was simply so beautiful like this when it was clear and the sun was setting, with stars beginning to become visible before her eyes. She knew what this girl was like. It would take a lot to snap her out of this mood of hers. It made her father worry heavily the later it got, since she could sometimes even end up simply staring at the sky for hours, completely losing track of time. Unfortunately for the girl, it appeared that her usual resting spot wasn't the best place to be lying today. As a small breeze began to flow through the trees, one of the nearby leaves found itself pulled from its home and carried along, drifting down as it traveled until it landed flat against the girl's face. She could hear the groan of annoyance from over here, the girl immediately leaning up and wiping her eyes as the leaf fell away. Their eyes met for only a moment before the girl was immediately looking away guiltily, her cheeks slowly turning red from embarrassment. Resisting the urge to laugh at the cute expression she was being shown, she made the final few steps she would need to close the gap before smiling down at the girl. "Did you forget the time again, Shizuku?" The girl in question refused to meet her eyes still, instead giving a small nod while trying to straighten out her hair. Unlike her own, kept in a short fashion that only ever reached her neck at its longest, Shizuku liked to keep it longer, typically letting it hang down till it was near the middle of her back in a long braid. She said it was cutest like that, but things might easily change a year from now. Last year she had preferred just having it flowing freely, while the year before it had been ponytails. This style was still quite new though, and she could already see Shizuku struggling to straighten out some of the strands and fix some of the mess she had made. And by the look of things, she was getting more and more upset about it with each passing moment. "Here. Let me," she said, taking the girl's hair into her own and gently doing her best to neaten it all out. It still wouldn't be perfect, that would require having to redo the whole thing, but she knew the girl never minded. Already she could make out the faint traces of a smile on Shizuku's face, one she was doing her best to hide. "You're out late again, you know," she said softly, trying not to sound like she was lecturing her too much. "Your father's going to die of worry someday if you keep this up." "Dad worries about everything too much," she heard back in response. The smile she could see on Shizuku's face didn't vanish though from the look of it. Despite the girl's words, she knew she enjoyed being the object of her father's worries. She took advantage of it more often than not too. "He's always so tense that I'm amazed he doesn't just rush out and start searching all over town." She paused for a moment, as if the thought of him doing so was suddenly a reality, and the expression she showed expressed exactly how she would feel if he did that. "You'd stop him, right, Mum? It'd be so embarrassing if he started asking everyone if they'd seen me anywhere. I'd be teased for weeks." "Your father is just worried, that's all," she replied softly to her daughter. Daughter. That word still sometimes felt weird to her. But here she was with one of her own, a girl she adored like the world itself, and had done so for the last 14 years that she had been alive for. "But don't worry, he won't go causing you trouble because of that. Yours is one of the few presences he could identify in a heartbeat, so unless you end up in trouble he'll keep himself from overreacting." "That's good," her daughter muttered, the smile returning a bit again as she finished the last bit of work she had to do on her daughter's hair. Happy that it would be good enough for the time being, and knowing Shizuka would be undoing it all within the hour anyway once back in the safety of their home, she let it fall back into place against her daughter's back. There. All done. A small murmur came back in response, but she knew her daughter well enough to be able to tell she was thanking her in her own shy way. She had taken bits and pieces from both her and her husband, but where her shyness had appeared from had never quite been answered. Maybe it was just because she had clung to her father a lot as a kid to solve the problems she had, or because she had been less interested in making friends with the other kids her age. There was little they could do to help her with the latter, and she hoped that it hadn't caused too many problems for her nowadays. But she did always see Shizuka hanging out with the same small group whenever she was out of the house, so that dimmed that worry slightly. Despite the friends she had though, Shizuka always ended up alone in one of the places she called her spots. Whether it was this park bench, a nearby tree that had just the right curve to it in the top branches for her to lie against, or even the patch of grass nearby when all else failed. She would always end the day staring at the sky, never seeming to want to reach out to them and instead satisfied only to watch. In the end, it seemed her daughter did like these small pieces of solitude. They made her happy, so for that reason she didn't make much of a fuss about her doing this so often. And in turn she knew her daughter would always spend her evenings in these spots rather than somewhere else in town. It was Shizuka's way of repaying her kindness in a way, a silent promise that she'd always be able to be found in one of these nearby spots if there was an emergency. "Well?" she asked softly. "Are you finished dreaming for the day?" Shizuka nodded, slowly pushing herself off the bench and offering her own hand towards her. "I've seen a few stars come out. I know where the others will be from them." "Is that so? Maybe you can point a few out to me as we walk home. I can never quite remember which ones are which." Those were all the words she needed to get her daughter to smile again, going off on an explanation about how the brightest star to their far right in the sky was the beginning of a large constellation. And how dead ahead you could see a barely visible speck that was meant to be really hard to find normally. So lost in listening to her daughter speak, she almost forgot to respond when a greeting was sent her way by a passing family. If she remembered correctly, they lived not far down the road from them. She didn't miss the silence that was suddenly coming from her right, however, Shizuka having gone dead silence and almost seeming to be using her as cover to hide behind. Waiting until the other family was far enough out of view, she sighed before glancing over at the girl, only now starting to act normally again. "You want to tell me what happened?" "Nothing happened," was the immediately answer she got given. Unfortunately for Shizuka, however, she was just as bad as a liar as her father. They both knew that she was lying, and just staring at her daughter like this, not saying anything, was enough to start to get her to squirm nervously. "I mean, it's not really anything much." Her voice trailed off before she began to turn her gaze towards the ground. "You weren't that nervous around the Macnolus last week when we saw them," Nozomi replied to her. "And I would have thought you weren't that nervous around their son either, considering you've shared classes together for years." Slowly coming to a step, Shizuka kept her gaze down as she tried to speak quietly, forcing Nozomi to listen closely to pick up her words. Are they true?" "Are what true?" "The rumors about Dad." "Oh. So that was what this was about." If she had to guess, she must have heard something about the war from years ago. But who? Ah. There was that new family that moved here a few weeks back. They must have recognized her husband and not been shy at running their mouths. It wasn't like the others in the town hadn't done the same at one point or another, but they had all run out of steam long before Shizuka was old enough to remember such talks. This time, she didn't really have that luxury. "What rumors did you hear?" At the very least she hoped it was a tame one. And not the one from how the war ended. But from the way her daughter was acting, it was probably the latter. They said he's a monster. That he's not even human and is only pretending until another catastrophe happens again. Dad's told me some stuff from how he saved people during the war, but they said he killed far more and was more of a monster than anyone else, friend and foe alike." Her luck really wasn't great today if her daughter had heard that. She could easily say that those rumors weren't true, but from the perspective of many they were. She remembered what the final days of the war had been like, when her husband had snapped under the pressure all sides had tried to bury him under and had gone on a one-man rampage through their armies to reach their leaders. No one knew how he won, and even now he refused to talk about it when asked, but he had managed to win, but at the cost of being seen as nothing more than a monstrous beast by many once their reason to be united faded. Too much power always bred fear, and fear was very easily to be twisted towards hatred. No one would raise a hand towards him because of their fear, but words were weapons that many could throw around without worry. Her husband had just accepted such words. He had been able to ignore them and continue on with his life. But Shizuka was different. She was still a child, and one that very much idolized her parents and saw them as heroes in the stories she heard. The problem was that such words weren't right. They did what was necessary in that war. That didn't make them heroes in her books because in war there could be no heroes. Only ordinary people and monsters, though her definition was very different from what those who used the name and threw it at her husband saw it. So what could she do to cheer her daughter up? Lie? That would not help her when she's older. She was sure to hear more of this later in life when she eventually leaves this town. People knew the Kurosaka name, and if things weren't great for her husband's relatives just from sharing the name, then it would be far worse for his own daughter. Should she try and make her think she heard things wrong? No, that was just as bad. The truth was not exactly best, but some of it might at least help. Your father saved a lot of people, she said softly, running a hand through her daughter's hair as she pulled her in closer. But a lot of people don't like to remember that in the way they should. To save people, he had to fight with all his strength. But he's not exactly a normal mage. You could say that he's the strongest person in all of Fiori. He doesn't seem that strong. That's because your father doesn't like to use his power much anymore. He's tired. The war took a toll on his mind, and since then he has always been more hesitant to interfere with matters as a result. And even when he does appear, his decision to appear the way he does to mages makes them uneasy, because they know all that energy and power is still here, just suppressed so heavily that they can barely sense a fraction of it. And for you who has been around him your entire life and not met any other mages, he is the base mark in your mind for someone's power. Then why? Why do they? People fear a lot of things, she muttered, her own memories from Edelas flooding back. What they can't control, what they can't contain, what they can't stop, they fear things that frighten them. And despite what your father did for them, most can't help but fear him. It doesn't mean he's a monster, it's just that they can't see past their own fear and label him as such. Then, what about me? Shizuku asked quietly, her voice breaking up part way through. Am I a monster? Releasing her grip slightly so she could turn her daughter towards her, she asked softly, is that what they said to you? That you're a monster? Shizuku slowly began to nod, tears visible in the brief moments her face was facing hers. They said that any spawns of a monster, are just as disgusting. That I'm just as bad as Dad. Because my magical power, is unnatural. That I'd be better off, dead. That's not true at all, she said, more forcefully this time to make sure her daughter couldn't ignore her words. You're my daughter, remember? I think I'd know if I gave birth to a monster. Instead, I had a beautiful little girl, who simply inherited a lot of magical power from her father. The only difference in that between you and other kids is that their fathers don't have nearly as much magical power, if they have much at all. That is certainly not a reason for you to be dead. Do you understand? Rather than a nod, she instead was grabbed by a small set of arms instead, her daughter hanging onto her for dear life. So instead she settled for rubbing her back and letting Shizuka let it all out. There, she whispered softly, hearing the sounds of crying from her shoulder. Remember, they only say these things because they don't know any better. You aren't a monster at all, nor is your father. You're simply you, and he is he. Still, she would have to have some words with the ones who set her daughter off later on. For them to have reduced her daughter to this state, there was no doubt that this hadn't been just some passing comments and that they had been intentionally trying to hurt her daughter with their words. For now, however, that could wait. It was getting far too late. Waiting until Shizuka was finally finished crying, she led her daughter back by the hand, keeping a strong grip on it as a form of reassurance. Opening the door as they finally reached the house, she found it unusually quiet for once. Wasn't her husband still home? And where were the twins? Shizuka wasn't the only child she had. Yuato and Ryoji had been born 7 years ago now, both boys born a day apart, and were never this quiet usually. She almost felt herself reaching for her weapon out of instinct when a man with bright orange hair stuck his head out from around the corner, peering out at her in the hallway. A smile immediately filled his face at the sight of her, just as it always did. Ichigo, she had been married to this man for 15 years now, after having dated him for 3 years beforehand after the war ended. Just looking at him now, she would be hard-pressed to find a single difference in his appearance. He looked exactly the same as he did back then, except for the change of clothes and his obvious attempts to make himself look older. But for her who had been with him all that time, it didn't fool her. Only his eyes had really aged, with both pain and happiness that normally hit him at the same time. His instant restoration was seen as nothing more than a curse in his eyes during times like this. That smile on his face began to change as he noticed the girl standing beside her, a look of mocking sternness being directed at Shizuku. When I said keep her out late, I didn't quite mean this long, Shizuku. Sorry Dad, Shizuku muttered in embarrassment. I was stargazing for too long and it took Mum longer to find me. Right Mum? The look sent at her was filled with utter pleading, begging her to not say anything about what she had told her before. She supposed she could play along. If her husband knew anything about the situation, he'd only end up tearing himself up about it, knowing that he would only make things worse if he did anything to intervene. But she could at least get some fun out of this if she was going to lie. Shizuka was so out of it that she didn't even realize she was leaning too far until she fell out of a tree. Mum. Her husband sighed, running a hand through his hair as he turned his gaze back to their daughter. Again Shizuku? I thought I told you to be more careful? Isn't this the 5th time it's happened this month? I'm amazed you don't get injured. Or maybe you do have the same kind of monstrous quality healing factor like I do. I am. I mean I normally am. Shizuka replied, not realizing her eyes had gone wide in fear at hearing a particular word. I'm careful enough. Anyway, she added, turning back to Nozomi with a wide smile on her face. Happy birthday Mum. Her birthday? Oh, that was today wasn't it? It wasn't exactly the day she was born if she was being honest. She had picked it years ago when she had revealed to her brother that she didn't know when her birthday was. So he had just given hers his on the assumption that they would line up there. It was probably the correct day, but she still had a habit of forgetting when it was approaching since it had been hard to fully associate it with herself for years. She couldn't dwell on her thoughts for long, being dragged forward by both her husband and her daughter towards the living room. A flick of the lights and the whole room was lit up by chains of small lights near the ceiling. In the center of the room she could already see a table filled with all her favorite foods, some of it slightly burnt in areas that was likely a result of Ichigo trying to handle too much at once in preparation for all of this. There was even a large cake in the very center, a set of candles on top of it waiting to be lit. Bit much? Ichigo asked sheepishly. I was trying to make it special and all, but when the boys started giving suggestions and we started adding more things to the list and... He just settled for smiling as he trailed off with his rambling. Happy birthday. She wasn't quite sure what to say, but she was sure her happy smile said enough going by the eyes of her family. Two stirring forms seemed drew her eyes to the corner, Yuato and Ryoji opening their eyes from the noise. They must have been tired waiting up for her to get back after all this work. Of course they only had to lay eyes on her for all that drowsiness to vanish, leaping up from the sofa they were lying on and rushing towards her. In the meanwhile, both Ichigo and Shizuka had moved by the cake and she could see him telling her daughter something with a smile. After a few moments he was raising a finger and lighting a small flame at its end, using it to light each candle as he kept up whatever explanation he was giving her. She doubted Kisuke had ever predicted one day that Ichigo would be explaining to his daughter how to light a cake's candles using a low-level Hada spell. The twins slowly separated from her as they noticed the cake, multiple voices beginning to sing out as they beckoned her over to blow out the candles. The smile on her face simply couldn't vanish. It felt like it wouldn't end. Never had she felt so happy, so content, before. Not this much, at least in any moment before all of this. This life, to her. It's perfect, isn't it? A voice spoke far away from her, watching her every action with the interest of a kid with a new toy. Your every wish is granted, your every desire brought forth. You haven't even noticed yet, have you, Nozomi? That the world you are living in right now." He smiled sinisterly, the grin truly making him appear more like a demon than his appearance normally did. "Is nothing more than a beautiful dream. Protector of the fairies." Deflecting the hollow's sword with his spear, Mist Ogden leapt up quickly over Ulquiorra and let loose a rain of arrows of light down below him. They served little point beyond distractions, all breaking harmlessly the moment they hit the hollow's skin, but the action had Ulquiorra distracted for a moment in dealing with them. That was plenty of time for Starkey to close the gap between the two of them and swing his own sword. Responding just as quickly, Ulquiorra's own blade came back up and caught the other blade against its edge, a Ciro already being charged rapidly in his other hand. The speed couldn't compete with Starkey's own though, a bright blue Ciro appearing, fully forming, and firing all before Ulquiorra could finish the second step. Leaping back through the destructive beam, his own Ciro firing off its unstable energy to give him an escape, Ulquiorra quickly used the remaining energy of the Ciro as cover to appear back around at Starkey's blind side. A Ciro formed just as quickly, firing off, but the Hollow already knew this trick from their previous clashes, avoiding the blast by a hair's breadth and slicing down with his blade. Mist Ogden was there to stop it from making contact, however, slamming foot first into Ulquiorra's face as fast as he could and forcing the Hollow to move back a step, his blade missing Starkey and slamming against the hastily raised spear instead. With Ulquiorra off-balanced, Starkey quickly moved in with Mist Ogden to try and take advantage of the opening, his sword slicing up while a chain of light flew forward and wrapped itself around the wrist of Ulquiorra's sword hand. Rather than allowing himself to be pulled forward into Starkey's path, Ulquiorra dug his feet in and instead used his own strength to rip Mist Ogden forward, knocking him into the back of Starkey and disorienting them both. Before they could recover, he already had a Ciro charged, firing it point blank at them. That attempt to crush them failed when bright blue light began to piece through the green energy of his own Ciro. Even in that state, it seemed to him that Starkey could still fire off Ciros of considerable power and strength. But for once his was having the upper hand. Knowing that, he already knew what the two would do next in response, his sword coming up ready and deflecting the thrust from Mist Ogden as the man shot out and around at him in the hopes to gain a surprise attack. Knocking the mage back, he had little time to act upon it before Starkey was forcing him back now that the last remnants of the Ciros were gone, launching slice after slice with his blade and forcing him onto the defensive. Any attempts he made to push back were crushed by the rapidly appearing Ciros, forcing him to make instant decisions the moment he saw them and use his chances for attacking to destroy them before they could finish forming. With one final slash, Starkey threw more of his strength into the blow and forced Ulquiorra back further. In that moment Mist Ogden acted, throwing his spear forward and letting the magic coating it accelerate it towards its target. It was enough to force Ulquiorra to go flying back, even when the point was blocked by the blade, until the Hollow slammed straight into the wall. After a few seconds of motionless, the spear darted back through the air in a straight path towards its wielder, returning to Mist Ogden's outstretched hand. "We're getting nowhere," he said to Starkey, eyeing the form of Ulquiorra as the Hollow pushed himself out of the wall. "Even with the two of us, we haven't managed to get a proper opening." "I told you he was strong," Starkey replied, just as annoyed at the situation as Mist Ogden was. "This is far too much work." "Well? Any suggestions? You know him better than I do. Just keep at it. He'll slip up eventually. Unlike us, he's having to focus on two enemies at once who are both pressuring him immensely. He cannot keep this up indefinitely. So just keep throwing stuff at him until he messes up," Mist Ogden muttered. "Great, that's a helpful plan. If you've got one better." "Aw crap." "Aw crap what?" "That," Starkey said in annoyance, seeing Ulquiorra pointing his sword at them. "He's already going for his resurrection." "What? Then let's dash." "Wait." Holding out his hand out in warning, Starkey kept his eyes glued completely on Ulquiorra. "Any wounds we do to him before resurrection are completely healed by its release. This is good for us. He'll be far stronger though. Just deal with it. He'd have to use it anyway, so let's control when he does more. Enclose, Mercy Lago." Ulquiorra's words cut through any other protests Mist Ogden wanted to make, latching all his focus onto him. A torrent of black and green energy shot out around Ulquiorra and tore upwards before appearing to rain back down on them all, the hollow itself concealed from view as his form began to change. Keeping their guards up, Starkey and Mistoggen both waited carefully for the hollow to finally show itself again, not willing to risk running into any traps while the energy concealed Ulquiorra. As the energy finally began to fade, Ulquiorra's new form revealed itself. The usual white attire the hollow wore was now like a robe, stretching down to his ankles and closed tightly at the top. His physical appearance meanwhile had taken on many bat-like characteristics, resulting in large and wilder hair along with new horns stretching out from his hollow helmet to either side. His fingernails had lengthened too, acting in place of a sword, but the most obvious change was the pair of bat wings attached to his back. "Be on guard," Starkey warned. "Heal shit." That was the first time Mistoggen had heard the hollow panic so much, but the sight of the Zero charging up would do that. It wasn't the usual green of before. Instead it was pure black, the only extra color being the green that coated the edges. Just looking at it, he knew where he'd seen something like this before. It looked very much like the energy that Ichigo used in his Bankai when he used Getsuga Tenshou. Multiple blue Zeros were fired rapidly at Ulquiorra to try and stop him, but they did no good. Rather than trying to dodge, Ulquiorra just took the hits and finished charging his Zero. Bracing himself, Mistoggen prepared to dart out of the way of the blast only to find Starkey grabbing him beforehand and throwing him out halfway across the room away from him. "Hey! What are you dash? Zero Oscaris." Ulquiorra's words as he unleashed the Zero revealed the true meaning behind Starkey's actions. The blast barely missed him, leaving a large burn mark across his skin where it caught in passing, and filled up the entire area that he and Starkey had been in along with anywhere that they could have dodged to in time. The blast didn't stop there either, continuing to expand out and go further, tearing through walls until the desert was visible once again in the distance through the hole the hollow had made. Glancing at Ulquiorra in shock, he noticed the Zeros Starkey fired had done some damage. There were obvious burn marks across the hollow's body, but most of that was being healed rapidly by the hollow's instant regeneration. It hadn't been too fast before and they hadn't dealt any major wounds that could have been set back by the ability, but seeing it working so effectively on top of this massive boost in power was far too terrifying. His instincts kicked in as Ulquiorra started to move and he suddenly found himself flung backwards through the air, his spear barely managing to deflect the blow aimed at his chest in the process. What looked like a spear of pure green energy was held in Ulquiorra's own hand, being spun round until the hollow's grip on it was reversed. He immediately knew the hollow was about to throw it, so he didn't dare stay put, kicking off from the air while flooding his meteor spell with more magic. The spear shot past his head as he dodged, impacting against the wall behind him and exploding against it. He could feel the energy almost touching his back, desiring to consume him, but he kept moving until he was out of its reach. That was the moment Ulquiorra decided to make himself known again, one hand grabbing him by the head and throwing him through a wall. He tried to slow himself down before he hit the second one, but it was no good, his body breaking through it just as easily as the first before he finally managed to force himself to come to a stop before he hit a third. Immediately he had to dodge the side, one of the spears Ulquiorra could make slamming past where his head had been. He couldn't escape the explosion, the blast throwing him forward right into Ulquiorra's waiting arms. With one hand gripping him by the throat, the other swung a spear only to find its path barely blocked by Mistoggen's own, using all his strength to keep it at bay. "Impressive," Ulquiorra said, tightening his grip and forcing Mistoggen to begin to choke for air. "But how long can you keep this strength up?" Air. He needed air. The other spear was inching closer, and if his strength failed him then that would be it. Where was Starkey? Had that past Zero taken him out completely? Without warning, Ulquiorra suddenly released him and spun back round, deflecting a thrown sword and leaving it to clatter against the ground beside them. "So you recovered already, Starkey?" Bleeding heavily from his left arm, the whole left side of his shirt burnt away, Starkey brought up his right hand before running it through his hair. "This is so tiresome. You're far too strong in this state that it's unfair for us right now. That is the nature of battle. But if you feel so strongly about it, then release your own resurrection. That is, if you can reach your sword. Getting past you to reach my blade? Piece of cake. Mistoggen, now. Ulquiorra spun back round only to find no one there. Realizing he had been tricked, he turned back to face Stark only to find a set of 10 Ceros floating in the air before all of them fired. In comparison to the Cero Oscuras previously used by Ulquiorra, the barrage was nothing. But it still was enough to force Ulquiorra back and slam his spear into the ground, releasing the energy around himself and blasting away the attack from his body. That time was enough for Stark to close the gap, however, his hand grabbing his previously thrown sword and bringing it up just in time to deflect the thrust of a spear from Ulquiorra. You know, as fast as you might be like that, I can still follow your movements. That does not change the outcome of this battle. Just because one can track someone's movements, it does not mean they can keep up with them. Forming another spear in his other hand, Ulquiorra swung it round and forced Stark to disengage from the clash to avoid having his side opened up. Darting back, Ulquiorra spun in the air and knocked the spear thrown at him out of the way, throwing one of his own in response at Mistoggan. Right before he could finish reaching Mistoggan though, specks of blue light caught his eye as multiple Ceros began to form and fire from Stark's position near his side. Using a single spear, he threw it forward at the incoming blasts and detonated the energy in the mix to stop the blasts. The action, however, left him without any weapon for the moment, just as Mistoggan lunged forward with a blade of light in his hand. Dodging easily out of the way, Ulquiorra spun round and prepared to grab Mistoggan once again, only to see the spear that had been previously thrown by Mistoggan being caught and swung at him. Taking a step back in the air, the point of the spear narrowly missed his throat. In response, his hand lunged forward and grabbed Mistoggan by the head, throwing him back towards the room they had been originally fighting in and through a few walls in the process. Raising a finger towards him, another Cero Oscuras began to charge, Stark rushing to his ally's aid as he began charging multiple Ceros in response. Light began to shape around Mistoggan as well, forming a large arm that could be used as a makeshift barrier to protect the two of them, only for Ulquiorra to alter his aim at the last second towards the way they had entered. Seeing the action, Stark's eyes grew wide in realization before lunging forward into the path of the blast. No. The Cero fired and the entire area was consumed by the blast once more. Unlike last time where Stark had managed to scrap out of the blast with only moderate damage, this time it was far worse. Rather than facing the blast to just survive, he had thrown his back against the blast and used it as a shield to soak up as much damage as possible, leaving the entire area raw and burned black. He could only stand for a moment before he fell to his knees, and the moment his hands hit the ground Ulquiorra was there ready to take his head off. "This was your weakness," Ulquiorra said, keeping the tip of the spear resting against the back of Stark's neck. "I told you to release your resurrection if you could reach your sword. Since when did you assume I meant that blade you pretend holds your powers? When? How foolish. You tried to hide it so that Lord Barrigan would not know, but he already realized it from the start. That child that you pretend is so ordinary is the hiding place for your original power. A sword in the shape of a human. Lord Barrigan said it was amusing really, that a hollow like you who gained the powers of a Shinigami would have a Zanpakuta that shows its inner form to the outside world. Even your form appears the most human out of all of us, and very little of your hollow mask even remains. You are indeed the most Shinigami-like of all us hollows, the one closest to its own humanity. Some of us were even curious of how far you might be able to go beyond this and whether or not such a thing was indeed possible. But now watch," Ulquiorra added, another Cero Oscuras charging as he pointed it towards the smoke kicked up from the previous blast, "as I remove that threat you pose right now. Then, perhaps you will know the despair felt by those that dare challenge Lord Barrigan's will." "No. Don't. It's fine, Stark," Lilynet's voice run out, pausing even Ulquiorra as she stepped through the smoke. For a moment, Stark couldn't hide his relief at seeing she was okay. That quickly faded however when he saw the blade she was holding, held by her neck. "Lilynet. What are you?" "No. Interesting," Stark said, letting his Cero fade as he removed the spear from Stark's neck and took a few steps back to keep all of them in his line of sight. "But this is odd. You are afraid, so this is your response. And yet I don't see a fear of death in your eyes. Has my power not driven you to such despair yet?" "Wouldn't you like to know?" Lilynet shot back at him, turning back to Stark and putting on a wide smile. "Kill him for me, all right. Lilynet. No. She didn't listen, using her blade to cut her throat before Starkey could even make it a few steps towards her in his desperation. That didn't stop him from pushing himself forward, despite his condition, and sprinting out towards her, catching her body with his arms before it could hit the ground. Hey! Lilynette! Say something! He simply got a smile up at him in response before she croaked out a few words he could barely understand with her ruined throat. He couldn't even tell what they were, and before he could ask again she was gone, fading away in his arms until not even her sword remained on the ground beside them. Hopefully you see now how foolish your actions are and will realize the despair you have inflicted upon yourself. Ulquiorra's words did little to bring him back to reality, barely noticing the hollow until he was right in front of him. Tell me, do you possess a heart? To show such a look of despair on your face, to possess such worry and terror for her sake, you must certainly have one. Where is it? I am truly curious. Kick about, Starkey snarled, Ulquiorra's immediately swinging a spear down as he realized what Starkey was trying. Los Lobos. It was too late to stop him, energy releasing all around Starkey's body and pushing Ulquiorra back. When the energy finally began to clear, Starkey was revealed once more, all his injuries healed. His previous attire had been discarded for the grey fur-lined coat, worn over a white double-breasted vest. Dark skin-tight trousers replaced his previous ones, with grey knee-high fur leggings covering both legs with matching ones on his arms up to his elbows. Fur holsters hung at his waist, an ornamented gun rested in each. Finally there was the mask fragment on his face. His old mask fragment had disappeared entirely and now all he had was the eye hole from Lilynette's helmet over his left eye, chains holding it in place around his head. I understand, Ulquiorra said at the sight of Starkey. I was mistaken on my assumptions. I believed killing her would prevent you from using your resurrection, but in reality it merely causes the power to flow back to you. Instead I should have prioritized eliminating you when I had the chance instead of indulging in my own curiosity. Seeing guns raised towards him, he began to raise a spear in response. Very well. I will rectify this. Ciro Metrolita. Ulquiorra never got to finish those words. Instead the trigger of one of the guns was pulled, and 100 Ciros burst from its end in the blink of an eye. Protector of the Fairies. A lonely wolf howling at the moon. Why was it so quiet? How many years had it been since he had last asked himself that question? How many years had passed since he had been able to sit silently and not feel this weight? Enough years had passed that he had, at some point, stopped counting. For ageless beings like hollows, there was only the present and eternity. From his very beginning as a hollow, he had always felt this crippling isolation. He remembered nothing of his life as a human, only knowing that he must have been incredibly powerful to have been blessed so strongly as a hollow upon being transformed into one. It had made sure no other hollows that threatened him had ever been able to harm him. But that had only isolated him further. His own kind could not bear to be around him, lest they end up dead from his mere presence. Those that he managed to make friends of all perished through continued contact. He faintly remembered his time when he even cannibalized some of his own kind just to create small moments of interaction to bring something new to his life. Such acts never brought him much joy. His entire life was as empty as his heart, and as his strength grew further he only felt that crippling isolation even further. There was no one in this world that could stay by his side and live. There was no one in this world that he could truly trust as a companion and not have to be wary of. His was simply alone, at the peak of a mountain of corpses of those that had tried to use or fight him. It had been too much to bear. Every day was agony. Every day was torture. It never ended, never stopped, and there were so many times he had considered ending it all. What was the point of living in this endless desert with no one by his side? What point was there with this life if he was destined to forever be alone? He envied the weak. If he had been weaker, he might have been able to have friends. If he was weaker, he wouldn't have been so alone. And then, she appeared. And he did as well, one could say too. The one who could have been called his original self did end up perishing. In the end, the weight of loneliness was simply too much to bear. It was too painful, and so he took to such extreme measures to survive. For hollows, power was everything. But his old self was willing to risk throwing all that away for a chance to end that loneliness. And so that immensely power that belonged to one gave birth to two beings. There was him, Coyote Starkey, the one who would hold the power to guard them both. And then there was her, Lilynette Gingerbuck, the one who would act as the seal for their full power until such time that it was needed. Whenever an enemy appeared that he couldn't beat, they would fuse and the power that was once one would become available to them both. His form right now, well, he didn't know how much it resembled their original self. Those memories were fragmented, split between himself and Lilynette in such a jumbled order that they could hardly make sense of the finer details in them. As such, neither of them had ever known what the hollow that could be considered their parent or their original self looked like. Their fused state didn't give any clues either, as the form it took was his own due to him being the one meant to fight for the two of them. Despite the fact they lacked such crucial memories, neither of them had cared. Because they had both possessed that same feeling of loneliness and felt the relief that had begun to appear in each other's company. For the first time in their shared life, the weight was finally gone. He remembered crying that day. He supposed that was part of why many hollows found him and Lilynette as such odd beings. Most of their kind couldn't cry, and those that were human enough in appearance to be able to cry lacked the emotional range to do so. If he hadn't felt the sadness in his memories and his own happiness, he might never have done so either. Today, he felt like crying again. No matter where she had been, no matter how far apart they might have been, neither him nor Lilynette had ever felt alone. Because they could always sense the other's presence. They always knew where the other was, even when they were hiding like he did frequently to take his naps. As much as he hated being interrupted by them, he had never minded as much when she was the one antagonizing him. Because she was special. Even if everything was burnt to the ground, he could be happy so long as she was alive. And she had felt the same. But now there was nothing but silence in his soul. That comforting weight, that constant presence always there, it was gone. Snuffed out like a flame on a candle, there was no trace left of what had once been present there only moments ago. He wanted to scream out at the world. He wanted to claw his way into a hole and hide down there to drown out all that pain he felt. But he knew that pain would not end even if he did that. He had thought he had felt loneliness before from the memories he had inherited from his original self. But that hollow had always been alone, always envying others and painful enduring that feeling. What he was feeling was 100 times worse. The pain of being alone was an unbearable one. But the pain of losing someone, losing the one person in his life that mattered the most, and being thrown back into isolation? That was hell. A hell he was shackled to with no hope in sight. All he could feel was the pain from his loss. So he channeled that pain into the one other thing he could focus on right now. His original self had made it a priority to eliminate potential problems when they raised their hands against him. Right now, he was doing the same. Ulquiorra was making a good run for it, flying above the desert sands with great speed. But he was faster. It wasn't just in physical speed, allowing him to keep pace and even close the distance Ulquiorra had put between them. It was in his seros too. Aim and pull. That was the flow of motions his body was doing. Aim the gun at Ulquiorra, not even bothering to properly aim, and then pull the trigger. A barrage of seros was released every time he did so, reducing the need to even aim when they covered so much area, and to his eyes it appeared like Ulquiorra was doing everything he could to stay alive and outrun the blasts. It was pointless. No matter how little damage Ulquiorra would take from one sero, it was another matter from the hundreds he was firing. Releasing so many seros with each shot, allowing them to cover massive amounts of space and prevent Ulquiorra from escaping in any direction but away from him, and controlling how tightly packed the seros were to one another was resulting in culminating damage. Instant regeneration was a deadly technique to fight against, but if that was the case then all he had to do was do more damage than can be healed in time to save him or simply wait him out and let him be starved of his own magical power by trying to break free. This chase he was doing, it was so boring. Even the feelings of rage and anger were beginning to dim. Without Lilynette here, all emotions were beginning to fade in place of a sole one. He just wanted this to be over already. Tired of letting Ulquiorra continue to run, he put his full effort into chasing him down and caught up within a minute of the chase. Ulquiorra had done a good job at trying to keep away, first pulling them far away from Las Noches and then circling the area with the entire fortress in view at such range, keeping low to the sand. But with the final bit of distance he needed closed, he brought up both guns at once and fired. Dodging Zeros became a much harder task the shorter the distance was, provided he still kept a bit of range so he had time to aim properly, so he doubted Ulquiorra even had a chance to avoid this attack when there was this many being fired. Even so, he knew it would be unlikely to end without a fight. True to his beliefs, Ulquiorra gave up running and instead spun round to fight, one spear of green energy already being thrown at the incoming blasts. It was pointless. Whatever piecing power it has was nowhere near close enough to overcome the combined destruction power of his own strike. It barely slowed the blasts down. Raising his spear, Ulquiorra stabbed into the ground before him right as the blasts reached him, but even that wasn't enough to buy him much time. So instead he used the force of his own attack to help provide him with the required force to get out of the way in time. It didn't matter if he dodged it though. His guns moved and another barrage was fired. Ulquiorra used the same set of tricks once again, but he didn't care. All he had to do was fix his aim. Even if his attacks weren't connecting because of Ulquiorra's actions, those same actions were also damaging Ulquiorra in the process. Ulquiorra was being hurt faster than he could regeneration. So long as the final blow was struck, he didn't care how it occurred. The end result would always be the same, so if this was the way to reach it, then that was fine with him. He didn't have to keep it up for long for Ulquiorra to make a mistake. It had been admirable that Ulquiorra managed to keep it up for so long and remain composed. But then he was the top espada for a reason. The moment he saw his chance, he purposefully lowered one gun and continued firing with the other. Ulquiorra undoubtedly saw the opening, realizing that there was less danger on that side, and knew it was a trap. But it was an unavoidable route too. Ulquiorra's only chance was to use this opening and try and beat the trap to try and turn the tides back into his favor. He considered the idea for a brief moment. Then he raised his lowered gun back up, just as Ulquiorra shot into his line of sights. No need for spreading out the Zeros so much this time. All he needed was a single shot. 100 Zeros, focused down into a single beam, and then released in a single instant from the end of the barrel. Could Ulquiorra dodge? Retreating backwards here wouldn't be enough, nor would any form of retreating. He could adjust his aim too quickly there. So any attempts to dodge would be while Ulquiorra was charging. He had to be patient. Just wait. A chance would come, so long as he was willing to just watch for the moment. Ulquiorra was getting closer, almost within striking range, but there was still a chance he'd dodge if he read the moment wrong. He just had to wait until. There. The gun fired, just as Ulquiorra began to swing his arm. A second too late and he might have lost an arm. Instead it was Ulquiorra who lost one, his right arm severed entirely along with a good chunk of his right side. Odd. He had expected that to hit center mass. It seemed Ulquiorra had managed to read his move correctly, even if he had been too slow to capitalize on it. And now? Now Ulquiorra was missing an entire arm, cutting his offensive power in half. A second spear was being swung from Ulquiorra's other hand, but he easily brought up his other gun and caught it against the metal, holding the spear back for a moment while he kicked back off the air. The explosion that followed wasn't fast enough to keep up with him, and before it faded he had a gun pointed straight at the blast and fired. Mass Zeros was important this time, especially without any knowledge of where Ulquiorra was behind that blast. He bombarded the entire area, not letting up for a moment. Ulquiorra was still in there, and even after taking such damage he could still feel the hollow's magical power going strong. Ulquiorra may have been incapable of keeping up with him, but its power hadn't yet been diminished. Which was why he couldn't let up. He had taken one arm from him. Better to keep attacking and prevent there being even a single moment for recovery. After a minute of continuous fire, however, he finally ended it. As the smoke cleared, he waited for the surprise attack he expected to come from Ulquiorra, hoping to take advantage of it and end this long battle with a single blow. But it never came. Instead, he saw that Hollow meant to be taking advantage of such a moment, pushing itself out of the sand, bleeding everywhere and covered in burns. Honestly, he hardly recognized the Hollow with how ruined its body was from his barrage. "Are you really the first espada?" he asked. He should just end this, but he felt like he had to know for Lilynet's sake. To know whether he could have prevented her from killing herself to save him had he not been as wary about Ulquiorra's resurrection from the start. This power of yours is far too weak compared to mine. And if I was to judge it against others, I might even wonder if you would be capable of beating Tyr. It might be a tough fight for her, but I think she could beat you with her resurrection. Noises came from Ulquiorra, but they didn't sound much like words. More like groans. He must have damaged the hollow's vocal cords, and judging by the state of the hollow's body he was sure its instant regeneration had more pressing injuries to try and tackle first. I don't care how you respond, but I'd appreciate an answer. Are you really the first Espada? What reason did Barragan have to give you such a rank? At this level, I doubt it's because of power or speed or strength. What is it? Knowledge? Intelligence? Or simple favoritism? Sighing, he heard more groaning and grunts in response to his questions. So be it, he muttered, aiming one of his guns down at Ulquiorra's broken form. Looks like you died for nothing, Lilynet. I'm sorry. As he began to pull the trigger, he saw what had to be a last-ditch effort from Ulquiorra to fight back. The usual dark energy of the hollow was leaking out, wild and uncontrollable as if being urged by something, but he could submerge it all using his power. So he paid it no heed and just fired, not seeing the look being sent back up at him. He continued up with his blasts for a good 20 seconds before realizing something was up. In the midst of his own attack, others were detonating and leaking through, almost as if someone was fighting back against the barrage at rapid speeds with blasts of their own. Was that possible? He searched through his senses, but he couldn't find anything but Ulquiorra's down there. Was he wrong somehow? People could suppress their magic, and then hide them entirely with those cloaks he had seen the people in Ishgar wear. He was sure Mistoggan had cloaked himself in his own, as he hadn't been able to sense his ally in a while now, and he knew the man wasn't dead based on how he had left him in his pursuit. He definitely wasn't wrong, he realized. For someone to fight against his attack like this, they'd have to actually reveal their presence. So the only one capable of doing that was Ulquiorra himself, the one person he could sense in there. Except the energy he felt was wrong still. It felt like Ulquiorra in there, but there was something else too. A much stronger presence radiated from it, one he had felt before. Wasn't this the energy Barragan had? No. It wasn't. He realized it now, but he still wanted to confirm it. Ending his barrage, he lowered his gun and allowed the Ciro blasts to disperse. It was pointless to keep it up if Ulquiorra could continue to block them, and he had to get a feel on how much damage he had even done to know if firing so many shots was a waste of magical power or not. As his Ciros dispersed, he finally got a full reading of the energy before him. Without his own energy trying to crush it, he could feel it properly for once as it stretched out and stabilized. It was strong. As strong as his own from the feel of it. No, it felt stronger in fact. This was probably why he had mistaken it for Barragan's years ago. No one had ever felt this kind of power from Ulquiorra before. So this is why you're the strongest Espada, he said to Ulquiorra as the final remnants of the blast disappeared. What greeted him was something different to what he expected though. The coat worn before was gone now, exposing a bare white chest with a large hole through it beneath the neck. Black blood seemed to drip from that same hole, staining the front of the chest beneath it all the way down until it hit the black fur that now covered Ulquiorra's waist and legs. That same fur also covered his arms, with his fingers far more like claws now and his toes shaped into talons at the ends. The two bat wings were thinner in many areas and more demonic looking to his eyes, while two large tails of fur stretched from down past his knees. A slender tail continued much further, moving freely around Ulquiorra's body at the hollow's own whims. The face was what ended up drawing his full focus, however. Ulquiorra's eyes had turned yellow, with the sclera now green, and the tear marks beneath his eyes were now black and going all the way down to the edge of his face. Two large bat ears were present, but they weren't what he ended up taking his focus. It was the lack of a single object. There was no hollow mask. That was impossible, he found himself thinking to himself. A hollow without a hollow mask? And yet still possessed a hollow hole? The mask was what represented their existences as hollows, and all of them, even Barragan, had some aspect of it left whenever they transformed into their resurrection states. It represented their heart's new state, and the holes in their bodies represented the initial loss of it. And yet here was a hollow without one at all. Hollow? Human? Or somewhere in between? He muttered. Rather than becoming closer to a human, it appears like you've merely taken on traits from them but retained your hollow nature. But what is this feeling? It's odd, but... So you can't recognize that feeling? Ulquiorra asked him. It appeared like the hollow's vocal cords were working fine. Whatever Ulquiorra did, it appeared to have healed all his wounds. But how? Normally any who feel this so close up end up falling into despair. Is this a result of that girl killing herself? Has this damaged your heart so much that you can't comprehend the emotion my magic tries to instill in you? He felt his grip tighten on his guns at the mention of Lilynet. What is that form? That's what made Barragan so impressed with you, right? It's strong, but what is it? An odd question. But how to answer? Ulquiorra appeared to ponder over it himself for a moment before responding as emotionlessly as ever. I guess it can be considered a bankai for us hollows. A bankai? Was he serious? He couldn't be right? All Arankars like them had resurrections that gave them the ability to fight on par with bankai and even use even more power than them. Was there something even further beyond that? How dash? The question is irrelevant. I see no need to waste time explaining it. I have no need to gloat over this power. It is merely an ability I possess to be better utilized by Lord Barragan. I see. You have a name for it at least. Lord Barragan named it Resurrection, Segunda Etapa. After I taught him the method I used to realize this form, of course. You taught him. His mind was racing from the info. If this was the power felt by Ulquiorra when he used it, just what would happen if Barragan could use it too? He shook his head a few times as he tried to shake away those thoughts. It was fine. He could still beat Ulquiorra. That he was sure of. That was what he thought, as he raised his gun and fired. Until a bright green lance, the magic that made it up looking like flames on the surface of its shape, pieced straight through his blasts and tear away his own arm this time. Protector of the Fairies. Taoshiro frowned, looking towards the source of the disturbance in worry. Even at this distance, he could feel such an unsettling feeling weighting down on him. What was that feeling? It was hard to place, but it wasn't nice. He just wished he knew where it was coming from so he could know what was going on. He couldn't sense Mistogan anyway, and what he assumed was Starkey was now miles away, over at the source of that same odd energy. He would love to join them, except... well, he didn't know where he was right now. Tyr had been tough to fight at first. Her method of generation for water allowed her to turn his own ice into a weapon for her, but the same had been allowed to him in return. As a result, neither had truly had the upper hand. That was when she had flooded the entire area and caused the whole floor to collapse. The water had ended up washing him away despite his attempts to escape until he ended up in a massive underground complex, with what could have been substitutes for trees stretching up back to the roof. From there their fight had led them all around the area, until he had lost sight of where they had fell from due to the sheer scale of their new arena. She had called it the Forest of the Minos, a place that normally housed thousands of Minos Grandes. With them all gone and sent to the front lines, it was now an empty zone that neither had been afraid to fill with water and ice. The fight might have dragged on for much longer than it did if not for how far she had pushed him to his limits. It had all come to an end the moment the last petal shattered. Before, the speed he could freeze her water into ice and the speed she could convert his ice into water had been equal. But with his full power released, the balance was completely shifted in his favor. She hadn't even stood a chance after that, not when she had been frozen solid where she stood. After that he was meant to regroup with Ichigo, and he was trying to. He just didn't know how to. He had lost track of how far their fight had taken them. With such a wide open space, their battle had them running around and using it to its fullest. He could be only a minute away or could be miles, and he wouldn't know it because of how similar everything looked. There was no method of distinguishing what surrounded him now with what might surround him in a few minutes' time. In the end, all he could do was try and follow the magical power he could sense and hope it would lead to where he had come in from. Alternatively, he could try and smash his way through, but doing so held the risk of burying this whole place in sand from the desert above and blocking his escape. Sighing, He kept up his search as he let his senses linger on Stark's magical power for a moment. What was happening there? Were they winning? Losing? Perhaps the best move once he escaped here would be to regroup with him and Mistogan first and then lead a combined assault against Baragan to assist Ichigo rather than sending one person at once. However, he wasn't sure if his Bankai would last long enough if he did that. Keeping it maintained right now was starting to become taxing, even with how much he had tried to suppress it, and if he couldn't find the exit soon then he'd have to disable his Bankai and call it again once he was free, regardless of the additional time he'd have to waste waiting for it to reach maturity again. He supposed he would just have to hope luck was on his side for once. But with the feeling he was getting from the energy near Stark, he was starting to doubt it was. For some reason, he felt like this day was not going to end well. Protector of the Fairies. Dodging the bright green lance thrown at him, the spear slamming into the distance far behind him and causing the shockwaves it created to still be felt strongly at such distances, Stark raised a gun back up and fired a concentrated blast of Zeros towards Ulquiorra. To counter it, Ulquiorra swung the other spear he held against the blast, both attacks exploding against one another. Ulquiorra came rushing out of the smoke completely unharmed a moment later, his second gun already aimed and being fired at the approaching hollow. At the last moment Ulquiorra made a swift move to the left, tucking in his wings and rolling away from the attack in order to just barely avoid it. The second he was far enough away, his wings expanded back out and he was continuing his charge. Realizing Ulquiorra had gotten too close for him, Stark quickly holstered one of his guns and let a pale blue sword appear in his right hand, one still newly regenerated, and did his best to keep a solid grip on the energy as he prepared to take Ulquiorra's attack against his own blade. Quickly raising the blade in response to the strike, he managed to catch it before any of the weapon could make contact with him, if barely. He could feel the blade cracking from just holding contact against the dense energy packed into each of those spears, threatening to outright smash through it if he wasn't careful. 3 hits. That was about the limit of each blade that he made before it would shatter. The first hit would crack the blade. The second chip into it. And the third was when the spear would outright slice through it in its weakened state. He could repair the damage with his own energy, but he didn't get too much time to focus on that during their clashes. Ulquiorra was always quick to capitalize on any openings or weaknesses that he saw. Case in point, right now. As he tried to back away, putting some distance between himself and Ulquiorra, he found his opponent unwilling to allow him even a moment's reprieve. Narrowly dodging as the spear was thrust forward against him, using his sword to bat the deadly weapon out of the way of his chest, he tried to bring his other gun up only for Ulquiorra to quickly step in and close the distance between the two of them, a spear held tightly in his other hand. Acting quickly, he swung his gun out at the spear and caught it against the metal. Unlike his blades, his guns could take a hell of a lot of punishment. The problem was that he couldn't fire it like this. It could block but not attack, which was too much in Ulquiorra's favor in those situations. Too much of his power was locked up in his guns to be able to fight back, so if this kept up he'd end up falling first in this battle of attrition. Quickly bringing up his sword in an attempt to attack, he found it easily blocked by Ulquiorra's own spear. Rather than falling back with it, he immediately abandoned his grip and kicked back off the air, putting Ulquiorra off balance for a moment at the sudden action. In that swift moment he reached for his other gun and brought both to bear, firing just as Ulquiorra managed to recover. Not even a second after he had done so had a spear come thrusting out of the blast, straight towards his head. Narrowly dodging it, the action causing his stance to shift and for the rest of the Zeros to skim away from Ulquiorra, he rapidly tried to bring up one of his guns to block the spear being swung at him. For once it seemed Ulquiorra's grip was far too strong. The moment the spear struck the gun, it was ripped from his hand, leaving him no choice but to try and fall back and form a sword in his palm while the gun spun through the air towards the ground. Ulquiorra was not one to ignore such chances, pushing forward with his strikes and forcing him back further. His sword only managed to take 2 strikes before he threw what remained of it straight at Ulquiorra, using the moment he had to quickly create a replacement blade. When he could he tried to fire of Zero blasts, but Ulquiorra was fast enough to either force him on the defensive to stop him firing or to knock the gun's barrel off target and for the attack to fly off into the distance instead. Focus. Calm down. He was starting to panic under these strikes. An opening would come. Ulquiorra had to be using a lot of power and focus of his own to keep this offensive up. Their power was close enough that he could still break out of this so long as he didn't take a direct hit from one of Ulquiorra's attacks. He just had to wait, and there. Seeing his chance, he swung up with his sword as Ulquiorra swung out with one of his spears. Rather than trying to meet the blade midway and halt the spear in its tracks, he instead swung out with all his force at Ulquiorra's head, his side being exposed. In turn he spun his gun so that the barrel faced the ground, beginning to press off the air with his feet. At the last moment, he leapt up from the air, firing the gun and using the recoil to push himself up faster. The spear narrowly missed him, slicing through the air below his feet, while his own sword swung through the air at the harsh angle towards Ulquiorra. Dodging like that had put it off its original course. The blow now aimed to drag across Ulquiorra's shoulder and onto his chest, but he could accept that with the opening it would give. However, at the last moment, Ulquiorra still managed to dodge back, the blade missing the flesh by millimeters. He couldn't hide his shock for a moment, and it was then that Ulquiorra struck out in turn. His swung spear was discarded without a second thought in order to grab Starkey by the head and throw him downwards. Then, bringing his other arm back, he threw the second spear straight down at Starkey's falling form. Lanza del Relámpago. Bringing his gun up and pointing it directly at the approaching spear, Starkey fired everything he had into one blast. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough to stop it this time, the spear already too close and piercing straight through the blasts and into his chest. The explosion released by the blast was unlike any other he had ever experienced, and he was sure that anyone in the distance would think a second sun had suddenly appeared in the horizon, made of deadly green light. He felt out of the attack far before it ended, his entire body burned from head to toe from the blast. He could even feel the remnants of his hollow mask cracked in many areas, and the pain he felt as he hit the ground indicated he must have broken or pieced something important. Instant regeneration immediately kicked in. He could still fight, but even a full recovery was going to take a lot out of him. There was too much damage and he'd have to exhaust so much magic to get back into good fighting condition. He couldn't afford to take another hit like that. However, it didn't look like Ulquiorra intended to allow him a chance to even recover. Landing on the ground beside his body, Ulquiorra was already generating a new spear before lifting it with one hand, ready to use to piece his chest with. He couldn't wait any longer. He had hoped to buy a bit more time. Well, hopefully this would be enough. His voice hurt as he made a small whistle, one that went unnoticeable to Ulquiorra. He doubted the hollow could hear it. But others would. I should ask at least, Ulquiorra said, holding the spear up and readying for the final strike. Where was your heart? My heart. Ulquiorra was pausing. Why did he care so much about so-called hearts? Did he truly not understand such things? Was that why he sounded so obsessed with knowing the answer? Yes. Such a thing is so odd. In humans, it resides in their chests. And yet I hear stories about the hearts of others being left and carried on by their friends and family. Such concepts are odd. Is the heart then a conceptual object? Do they talk about the physical form? Or is there a different meaning behind it? I seek to understand this, to know what exactly a heart is and to understand what I lack. Oh. He understood now. Despair, wasn't it? He asked weakly. Every hollow tended to have some kind of emotion left over from their original death. Normally the cause that led to their hollowification or what they felt during that moment. He supposed his loneliness originally stemmed from him being transformed alone and without anyone he had cared for. Someone like Ulquiorra, he probably had fallen into despair when he changed. At some point he had probably lost even that, and yet still despaired in his own way about what was lost through a desire to understand that. Was your heart in that girl? Was it in the bond? If I had opened up her chest, would I have found something? Or would it have been held in the tendrils of energy that linked the two of you? Or is it possibly in your own chest? He chuckled. Don't know. Maybe it's in something else. Like a wolf. How foolish you are. Ulquiorra's response was cut as a blue wolf of energy grabbed him from behind, clenching its teeth around Ulquiorra's throat and attempting to rip it open. In the same moment other wolves lunged in, finding purchase on Ulquiorra's body wherever they could. Some bit into his legs, others arms, and others tried to use their claws to dig into Ulquiorra's back. Taking the chance he had, Starkey lunged forward. He had to thank Ulquiorra for letting his guard down. It had given him time to push his instant regeneration further, sacrificing less important areas and taking the pain they caused in exchange for getting the ability to move back faster. His gun swung up and he quickly brought it straight up and pressed the barrel against Ulquiorra's face. He didn't care how much damage Ulquiorra could shrug off. This many Ceros blasted straight to the face wouldn't be able to be ignored. He wouldn't get a chance like this again. All the wolves clinging to Ulquiorra began to glow, their energy building up and getting ready to detonate. For him, he just focused on bringing all the power he had left into the blast. Every last drop had to be sacrificed so he could end this in one blow. With all the energy he had, he pushed it forth and pulled the trigger. The explosion generated even threw him back, the force feeling like it would tear him apart too despite it being his own power. But he hung on anyway as best as he could, keeping the blast up and aimed at where Ulquiorra should still be. His power was draining rapidly as the blast continued, more Ceros than he had ever fired at once being forced out of the gun's barrel in one place, but he still kept it up. After another 20 seconds, he finally stopped. Not out of choice but from sheer exhaustion. He felt his legs give out beneath him as he fell to his knees, his gun falling to his side as smoke drifted from the barrel's end. That was it. He was out of magic. But even if Ulquiorra had managed to survive that, he wouldn't be in any good condition to fight. Is that the last of your strength now? No. That wasn't possible. Ulquiorra could have had no way to block that attack, and yet he was still alive and able to speak after all of that? That simply wasn't possible. Had his attack done nothing? No, it had done something. Ulquiorra's magical power was far weaker than it was before. And as he saw Ulquiorra step fully out of the smoke his attack had caused, he saw the state of the hollow. While it had taken a lot of damage to his front, especially his face, the sheer amount of magical power Ulquiorra possessed must have managed to mitigate the damage just enough to survive. And he could see the hollow's instant regeneration already at work, healing him at an alarming pace. It might have even been going on as his attack was happening, trying to repair enough of his body to keep him alive. The wolves confused me for a moment, until I realized they must have been a last-minute trick of yours. I did think I was able to knock one of your guns away too easily earlier. If he still had magic left, he might have been worried about Ulquiorra learning about that trick. He'd loaded up the gun with a lot of magical power beforehand and allowed the energy to leak out after being separated from him, forming wolves ready that would wait for his command and latch onto the target. But that last blast of yours was truly worrying. If I was a bit weaker, I doubted I would be able to reinforce my arrow enough to survive. And if my regeneration hadn't kept up, even that would have not helped me. I suppose it's true that a wounded animal is always its most dangerous when near death. But you have nothing left now, Ulquiorra added. And after that incident, I have little reason to continue my questioning. You seem unlikely to answer me, so I'll just finish this and go and assist Lord Barragan. You'll lose, you know, Starkey muttered, uncaring as a spear was aimed at his chest. Even if you kill me, you'll die too soon enough. That's the path that Mad King has taken us on, all for petty revenge. So. He sighed. You really don't care, do you? Not that it matters much to me. Even I find myself not caring any further. Not now at least. But no, this will end the same way for him too. Eventually he'll die, and I'm sure Lilynet and I will be laughing about it in another life. For a moment he thought Ulquiorra was going to say something in response to that. But whatever he wanted to say was quickly hidden away as the spear was thrust into his chest, forcing him back down to the ground and pinning him there. So this was death, huh? He felt himself wanting to raise a hand towards the sky for a moment, wondering what he'd feel if he did so. He had seen a few others do that when they were dying in the past, but not all. But as he began to move his hand, he stopped and then lazily lowered it. He supposed at least now he could have his rest. He was always so tired, and this time there would be no Lilynet to wake him up. Odd. He didn't feel as lonely anymore. He supposed it was because he'd see her again soon. She'd probably be really bored waiting for him, and would be so demanding too. A small smile appeared across his face at the thought of it as his eyes began to close. Perhaps he should enjoy this time then. He'd need all the energy he could to be able to keep up with her. After that, they could play all the games she wanted. For eternity if need be, so long as she was there again. So for now, he'd just rest. Watching the body as it began to fade away, breaking down into sand and being scattered in the winds to make up more of Hueco Mundo, Ulquiorra ripped his spear back up from the ground. The traitor has been dealt with. And now for the other. The question was where that human might be. It was difficult to focus on sensing that presence with the pain he felt, but he managed to finally get a glimpse of it. Odd. It was faint, but it was almost like it was above him. Out of curiosity, he turned his head up to look towards the sky. That was when the foot of a giant made of light slammed into his body. Protector of the Fairies. Check the description for the links to the author.